My name is Charlotte, and I am 28 years old. For 2 decades, my mother used heavy gold sewing scissors to manually snip my face out of our annual holiday cards. My sharp jawline and the dark birthmark on my neck disrupted her pristine Connecticut aesthetic. I was the secret they physically severed from the family narrative. Tonight I am standing on a freezing Manhattan sidewalk staring up at a 50-foot digital billboard illuminating the night sky. The face glowing down at the intersection of 42nd and Broadway is mine. I am the lead muse for a global French luxury campaign. They stripped away the thick concealer my mother forced me to wear and made my birthmark the centerpiece of the shoot. Yet the brand kept me anonymous. No name printed on the display, just my raw, unedited features towering over millions of people. The ultimate irony sat glowing in the palm of my hand. My phone screen showed a fresh Instagram post from my younger sister Olivia. She is in the city for her bachelorette weekend. The photo features her grinning, holding a cocktail directly underneath my billboard. Her caption reads, "NYC Aesthetic Goals." She has no idea she is standing in the shadow of the sister she just humiliated. Before I explain how 2 very different worlds collided in the most spectacular way imaginable, take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia Tells Stories. Only do this if you know what it feels like to be treated as invisible by the people who share your blood. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments below, so I know who is here with me. Let me take you back to this freezing midnight in Times Square. The wind cut through my wool coat, carrying the thick scent of roasted nuts from a nearby street cart and the sharp tang of exhaust. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the chaotic neon light around me. I tilted my head back, letting the icy drizzle hit my skin as I studied the colossal image of myself. The fashion house wanted authentic grit. They captured the exhaustion in my eyes, the hollows of my cheeks, the very flaws my family spent my childhood trying to hide. I shoved my free hand deep into my pocket, seeking warmth, and my fingers brushed against thick, textured cardstock. It was the wedding invitation that had arrived in my Brooklyn mail earlier that week. The envelope was heavy crafted from the kind of expensive nautical paper favored by elite planners in Mystic. I did not need to pull it out to remember the insult attached to the back. A bright yellow sticky note written in my mother Beatrice's neat cursive. It did not invite me to sit with the family or join the bridal party. It assigned me to handle the guest book and manage the coat check. Keep out of sight was the unspoken directive. How would you react to seeing your face dominating a city skyline knowing nobody recognizes it is you? I stood there shivering, trapped between the towering proof of my success and the crumpled yellow paper reminding me of my designated worth. I was a high-fashion centerpiece to the world and a glorified servant to my mother. A hurried tourist clutching a plastic shopping bag shoved hard past me on the crowded corner. The impact knocked me off balance, sending me stumbling into a puddle. Instead of standing my ground or shouting back, I shrank instantly. I hunched my shoulders, wrapping my arms around my torso, and whimpered a frantic apology to the stranger who had just pushed me. The billboard above me projected untouchable power, but down on the wet concrete, I was still the same terrified girl, waiting for the gold scissors to sever me from the frame. That freezing rain in Manhattan washed the present away, dragging my mind back 5 years to a December night in Connecticut. To understand how I ended up staring at a towering, anonymous version of myself, you need to see the exact moment I realized my family wanted me invisible. I was 23 years old, living back under my parents' roof in Westport after a miserable post-college job search. Westport is a town that demands flawless performance from its residents. The air there always carries the sharp scent of damp pine needles from the pristine wreaths hanging on every colonial front door. Success is measured by the perfection of your holiday aesthetic. Our family photo shoot that year had been a rigid, exhausting production. My mother Beatrice treated the annual holiday card like a high-stakes public relations campaign. She had ordered matching cream-colored cable-knit sweaters for the 4 of us. The photographer, a pricey professional hired out of Greenwich, set up his equipment in our living room next to a meticulously decorated spruce tree. Beatrice orchestrated every detail with military precision. She spent 20 minutes adjusting my younger sister Olivia, ensuring the lighting caught her conventional blonde hair and bright blue eyes just right. Olivia laughed naturally easily, fitting into the catalog-ready image our mother craved. When it was my turn, Beatrice frowned. She pulled the thick collar of my sweater up as high as it would go, trying to mask the dark birthmark on my neck. She physically pushed my shoulders back, angling my face away from the lens to soften my sharp, unconventional jawline. "Stand further back, Charlotte," she instructed, her tone tight with irritation. "You are casting a shadow on your sister." Her obsession with appearances was born from a very dark terror. During the financial crash of 2008, our family nearly lost everything. We hovered on the brink of foreclosure for months. Beatrice, a former local pageant runner-up, watched her wealthy country club peers judge her shrinking status. She clawed her way back into Fairfield County high society by projecting an illusion of flawless prosperity. Poverty and failure terrified her more than death. In her mind, any visible flaw invited rejection from the elite circle she worshipped. My face, with its harsh angles and unhidden birthmark, represented a flaw she could not afford to advertise. 2 weeks after the photo shoot, the custom-printed cards arrived. Beatrice spent an entire Thursday evening at the kitchen island, addressing thick envelopes to every important contact in her social registry. I stayed upstairs, avoiding the tension that always radiated from her during these performative rituals. Around 10 o'clock, she called out from the bottom of the stairs, assigning me the chore of taking out the recycling before I went to sleep. I pulled a heavy coat over my pajamas and carried the overflowing blue bin down our long manicured driveway. The Connecticut winter air bit at my cheeks. The gravel crunched under my boots. As I hoisted the bin to dump its contents into the larger street-side container, my grip slipped. The plastic edge caught on my coat sleeve, tilting dangerously. A cascade of paper and cardboard spilled out across the damp driveway. I dropped to my knees in the biting cold, gathering the scattered debris. Soda boxes, junk mail, discarded catalogs. Then my hand brushed against something different. The stiff, slick texture of premium photo paper. I picked up a glossy fragment illuminated only by the dim yellow glow of the street lamp. It was an eye. My eye. I found another jagged scrap resting on a wet pile of leaves. It was the lower half of my face, the distinct angle of my jawline, and the edge of my birthmark. My stomach plummeted as a cold wave of nausea hit me. I began digging frantically through the spilled recycling, clawing past old newspapers and empty envelopes. I found a dozen more pieces. They were the discarded remnants of the original family portrait. Beatrice had not just asked the photographer to crop me out digitally. The digital proofs must have been delayed or incorrect. So she sat at her kitchen island with her heavy gold sewing scissors and manually snipped my body out of the physical prints before sliding them into the holiday cards. She painstakingly tailored the image, leaving only Olivia and my father, Julian, sitting together smiling around an empty space where I used to be. The cuts were precise, ruthless, and deliberate. She had literally severed me from our family history. Have you ever stumbled upon physical proof of your own erasure? It does not feel like sadness. It feels like all the oxygen has been sucked out of the atmosphere, leaving you suffocating in plain sight. I stayed on my knees on the freezing gravel, clutching the severed pieces of my own face. My hands shook so badly the glossy scraps rattled against each other. The cold seeped through my pajama pants, but I could only feel the burning heat rising in my chest. For years I endured her subtle remarks, her pointed critiques of my wardrobe, the heavy concealer she bought me for my birthdays. I convinced myself she was just overbearing. I reasoned that her harshness was a misguided form of maternal protection, trying to save me from the judgment of a cruel world. But holding those mutilated photographs shattered that illusion. This was not protection. This was extermination. I gathered the handful of sliced paper, pushed myself off the gravel, and marched back up the driveway. I did not take off my boots when I entered the house, tracking wet dirt across the pristine hardwood floors. The house was quiet. My father was likely asleep in his study. Beatrice stood in the kitchen, wiping down the marble countertops with a microfiber cloth. The heavy gold sewing scissors rested near a stack of leftover envelopes, catching the soft pendant lighting. She turned as I entered, her expression shifting into immediate annoyance at the muddy footprints I was leaving behind. "Charlotte, what on earth are you doing?" she began. I walked forward and slammed the handful of glossy scraps onto the immaculate marble island. the pieces of my face scattered across the white stone. Beatrice stopped wiping the counter. She looked down at the mutilated photographs, then slowly raised her gaze to mine. She did not gasp. She did not apologize. Her face remained a mask of cool, indifferent stone. I wanted to deliver a powerful, cutting speech. I wanted to calmly dissect her cruelty and leave her speechless with my articulate, righteous anger. But human emotion rarely follows a neat script. The pain expanding inside my ribs was too raw, too chaotic to form coherent words. I looked at the gold scissors. I looked at the scraps of my face. I looked at the mother who preferred a customized lie over her real daughter. A high-pitched, ugly sound tore its way out of my throat. I grabbed the nearest object on the island, a heavy ceramic coffee mug filled with leftover dark roast, and hurled it directly at the pristine white wall behind her head. The ceramic shattered with a loud, explosive crack. Dark brown liquid exploded across the expensive paint, raining down over the stainless steel appliances. Shards of pottery cascaded onto the floor. Beatrice flinched, taking a quick step backward, but I did not stop. I lost every ounce of dignity. I screamed incoherently, a raw primal noise that burned my vocal cords. Tears poured down my face, mixing with the frantic, erratic breaths tearing through my chest. I slammed my hands onto the marble island, sobbing openly, uncontrollably, gasping for air as the devastating reality of my existence in this house crushed me. I sounded like a wounded animal trapped in a corner thrashing against invisible walls. "You ruined the aesthetic," I managed to choke out, my voice cracking, pitching high and hysterical. "Is that it? Am I that hideous to you?" Beatrice stood rigidly amid the broken ceramic and stained walls. She smoothed the front of her cashmere cardigan, her posture defensive but unyielding. "You do not understand how this town works," she said, her tone unnervingly flat. "People judge. They look for weakness. They look for reasons to exclude us. Olivia gives them nothing to critique. You, Charlotte, you invite their pity. I am shielding this family from being discarded." She believed her own twisted logic. She genuinely thought excising me from the frame was a necessary sacrifice to keep the wealthy wolves at bay. I stared at her through my tears, watching her carefully step around the spilled coffee to avoid ruining her slippers. There was no love left to salvage here, only a manic obsession with survival through deception. My lungs burned, my face felt swollen and wet. I wiped my nose with the back of my coat sleeve, abandoning any attempt to look composed. I turned away from the kitchen, leaving the jagged pieces of my photograph on the counter. I marched toward the staircase, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew I could not spend another night under this roof. I had to pack my things and run before this house consumed whatever fragments of my identity still remained. But making the decision to leave was one thing. Escaping without a safety net was about to prove far more difficult than I ever anticipated. I took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the burning in my throat from screaming. My bedroom felt foreign now, just a storage space for the girl my mother wished I was. I dragged a faded canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet and started throwing things inside. Jeans, sweaters, a few scattered books, my camera. I did not fold a single item. My hands moved on pure, frantic instinct, trying to outrun the crushing weight of what had just happened in the kitchen downstairs. The house remained dead quiet. Beatrice had not followed me. She was undoubtedly busy wiping spilled coffee off her pristine walls, prioritizing the expensive paint over her fleeing daughter. Zipping the bag shut, I threw my heavy wool coat over my shoulders. I did not have a master plan. I only knew that staying in Westport meant suffocating slowly until there was nothing left of me but an empty shell. I crept down the back staircase leading to the garage. The air turned frigid as I pushed open the heavy fire door. Standing next to my beat-up sedan was my father, Julian. He wore his usual gray fleece quarter zip, his posture stooped and defeated. Julian worked as a corporate actuary in Hartford, dealing with risk assessment and probability for insurance firms. He brought home a substantial 6-figure salary, making him the sole financial provider for our household. But monetary providing was the absolute limit of his authority. Years ago, he surrendered domestic control to Beatrice, trading his voice for a quiet existence. He was a deeply passive man, terrified of his own wife and unwilling to disrupt the fragile peace he purchased with his silence. I stopped in my tracks, clutching my duffel bag to my chest. I braced for an argument, preparing to defend my departure. I thought he might block my path or demand I go back inside to apologize. But Julian did not raise his hand. He glanced nervously back at the door leading to the kitchen, a frightened look darting across his features. He scurried over to me, closing the distance between us like a startled thief in his own home. "Charlotte, wait," he whispered. His voice barely registered over the low hum of the garage refrigerator. I stared at him, my chest heaving. "Are you going to stop me?" He shook his head vigorously, refusing to look me in the face. He reached into his fleece pocket and pulled out a fistful of cash. He seized my hand and shoved the crumpled bills into my palm, folding my stiff fingers over them. I looked down at my hand. It was $500 bills. $500 from a man who managed multi-million-dollar corporate accounts. "Take this," he urged, still keeping his tone to a hushed, anxious murmur. "It is all the cash I have in my wallet right now." I looked from the wrinkled money to his pale face. "You make $200,000 a year, Dad. You could wire me enough to actually get on my feet. You could help me." His face flushed a sickly shade of crimson. "I cannot do a wire transfer, Charlotte. Beatrice checks the joint accounts every morning. She tracks every single transaction. If she sees money moving, she will demand answers. Please just take the cash, and please do not tell her I gave it to you." The realization hit me harder than the broken mug shattering against the kitchen wall. My father was not trying to save me. He was trying to buy his own absolution while covering his tracks. His fear of Beatrice far outweighed his basic duty to protect his child. He loved me enough to offer pocket change, but not enough to withstand a single argument with his spouse. He chose his own comfort over my survival. I stuffed the crumpled bills into my coat pocket. I did not say thank you. I threw my bag into the back of my car and got into the driver's seat, leaving him standing alone in the cold garage, clutching his cowardly peace. I drove straight to the Westport train station, abandoning my car in the long-term lot. The platform was deserted, bathed in the harsh yellow glow of sodium lights. When the Metro North commuter rail pulled up, I boarded blindly, seeking refuge in the empty rear car. The doors slid shut, sealing me inside a metal tube, hurtling away from the only life I had ever known. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks became a relentless metronome under my feet. Heading south toward Grand Central Terminal, the scenery outside my window morphed rapidly. The manicured estates and pristine shorelines of Fairfield County faded into the gray industrial sprawl of Bridgeport and Stamford. Rusted factories, graffiti-covered brick walls, and wet concrete zipped past, blurring together in the freezing rain. I rested my forehead against the chilled glass, watching the water droplets trace frantic paths across the dark pane. "What is the hardest train ride you have ever had to take alone?" I sat in the worn vinyl seat, feeling the gravity of my situation wrapped tight around my throat. I had no safety net. I had no wealthy family backing me. I was armed with a duffel bag of wrinkled clothes and 5 crumpled $100 bills hiding in my pocket. The reality of my isolation was staggering. Beatrice had severed me from the holiday cards, but Julian had severed me from his protection. I was entirely untethered, drifting into a brutal city with almost nothing to my name. The adrenaline that carried me out of the house began to evaporate, leaving a cold, hollow terror in its wake. My breathing grew shallow. A tight knot formed in my chest, restricting the air entering my lungs. I tried to focus on the blur of passing city lights, but my vision swam. Tears spilled over my eyelashes, hot and fast. I clamped my hands over my mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but a jagged sob tore free anyway. I leaned forward, pulling my knees toward my chest, rocking slightly in the seat. The tears came harder now, washing away the last traces of defiant anger and replacing it with raw, unfiltered panic. I began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps punched through my throat. I could not catch my breath. I felt like I was drowning right there in the middle of the quiet train car, unable to control my own lungs. "Tickets, please." The conductor's voice pierced through my breakdown. I jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion. He stood in the aisle, holding his hole puncher, looking down at me with mild impatience. A few late-night commuters in the seats ahead turned around to stare, their expressions caught between annoyance and awkward discomfort. I scrubbed my wet face with the back of my hand, trying to steady my erratic breathing. Just a second, I choked out my voice, wavering pitifully. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieving my thick leather wallet. My fingers were trembling so fiercely I could barely work the metal zipper. As I tried to pull out the paper transit ticket, a sudden lurch of the train sent me off balance. The wallet slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the sticky aisle floor, scattering my entire life across the dirty linoleum. Coins rolled beneath the seats. Credit cards identification my meager cash, and old receipts fanned out over the spilled beer stains and crushed peanut wrappers left by previous passengers. "Oh, God," I whimpered, dropping to my knees. "I am so sorry. I am sorry." I scrambled across the filthy floor, my tears blinding me as I frantically scooped up pennies and plastic cards. My bare knees soaked up the sticky grime from the aisle. The humiliation burned through my veins. I kept muttering pathetic apologies to the conductor and the annoyed passengers who shifted their heavy boots away from my grasping hands. I was a desperate, weeping mess crawling on the floor of a commuter train, stripped of any remaining dignity. The conductor sighed heavily, kneeling down to help me pick up the last few scattered cards before punching my ticket and moving on to the next car. I collapsed back into my seat, clutching my restored wallet tightly to my chest. I spent the remainder of the journey staring blankly at the fabric pattern on the seat in front of me, trying to force my heart rate back to a normal rhythm. When the train finally plunged into the subterranean tunnels beneath Manhattan, the sudden darkness felt like a physical warning. The doors opened into the chaotic, echoing expanse of Grand Central. I stepped onto the platform carrying my heavy bag. My father's $500 still burned a hole in my pocket. It was supposed to be my temporary lifeline. Earlier that week, I had wired the rest of my meager personal savings to secure a sublet in a warehouse district across the river. I clung to the hope of that small apartment waiting for me. I had a destination. I had a roof over my head, or so I believed. Stepping out into the freezing city air, I had no idea that the safety net I purchased did not actually exist. The city was about to teach me a ruthless lesson about trust and survival. The subway train rattled over the Manhattan Bridge, shaking the carriage before grinding to a halt at the York Street station in Brooklyn. I dragged my canvas duffel bag up the concrete stairs, stepping out into the freezing darkness of down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass. Dumbo was a neighborhood defined by the relentless noise of repurposed warehouse lofts and the harsh, bitter wind whipping off the East River. That wind cut through my wool coat, stinging my cheeks as I navigated the cobblestone streets. I clutched a printed piece of paper containing an address on Water Street. This was supposed to be my safe haven. A week prior, I had wired $3,000, the entirety of my personal savings, to a broker named Marcus to secure a modest sublet in a shared loft. It was a steep price, but it promised immediate occupancy. I found the heavy iron door of the building and buzzed the apartment number. A loud crackle sounded through the intercom before the heavy lock clicked open. I hauled my bag up 3 flights of steep industrial stairs, my legs aching from the journey. I knocked on the heavy wooden door of apartment 3B. A few seconds later, the door swung inward. A tall man in gray sweatpants stood in the threshold, holding a half-eaten slice of pizza. He looked at me, then down at my heavy duffel bag, his brow furrowed in confusion. I offered a tired, polite greeting and explained that I was the new subtenant Marcus had arranged. The man blinked several times before setting his pizza down on a nearby side table. He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. He told me there was no Marcus. He told me he owned the loft and had never listed a room for rent. He explained with pity in his voice that someone had been copying photos from old real estate listings and posting them online to scam desperate renters. My lungs tightened. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number the broker had used to text me the contract. A robotic, automated voice immediately informed me that the number had been disconnected. The reality crashed down on my chest, suffocating and heavy. The wire transfer was gone. It was an untraceable transaction. I had handed over every dollar I owned to a ghost. The man in the doorway offered to let me use his phone to call the police, but we both knew the authorities could do nothing to recover wired funds sent to a burner phone. I thanked him quietly, turning around and descending the long industrial staircase. I dragged my bag down the block until my legs simply gave out. I collapsed onto my canvas luggage sitting on the icy concrete sidewalk. The towering brick warehouses cast long, dark shadows over me. The bridge above roared as another train passed over the river, shaking the pavement beneath my boots. I buried my face in my hands, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing wind bit into my skin. What was your first brutal failure in a new city? I sat there on the street corner realizing I was functionally homeless on my very first night. My entire net worth consisted of the 5 crumpled $100 bills my father had shoved into my coat pocket. Miles away in the wealthy coastal enclaves of Connecticut, a very different kind of financial crisis was unfolding. My 26-year-old sister Olivia stood in the pristine kitchen of our Westport home. Olivia was the golden child. She possessed the conventional blonde hair and striking blue eyes our mother prized. Raised to believe her physical appearance was her greatest asset, Olivia lived a shallow image-obsessed existence. She curated her life strictly for internet aesthetics, remaining terrifyingly oblivious to the emotional undertows of her own family. She slammed her customized tablet onto the marble kitchen island. Standing across from her, Julian rubbed his temples trying to soothe an incoming headache. Olivia was demanding a vintage coupe-glass champagne tower for her upcoming wedding reception. The rental and setup fee cost $5,000. Julian pointed out that they had already exceeded the wedding budget by $20,000. He suggested standard champagne flutes instead. Olivia crossed her arms, her lower lip trembling as she weaponized her tears. She argued that standard flutes would ruin the entire visual aesthetic of the reception. She claimed her special day would be ruined if the photos did not look perfect. Julian hesitated. He loved his daughter, but more importantly, he feared his wife. He knew Beatrice would unleash weeks of domestic hostility if Olivia complained about her wedding looking cheap. Julian opened his leather checkbook and scrawled his signature across a check for $5,000, handing it over without another word of protest. He had given me $500 to run away in the dead of night to avoid a fight with his wife. He gave Olivia 10 times that amount for stacked glassware to avoid the exact same thing. Back in Brooklyn, my reality was stripped of any such luxury. 3 days passed in a haze of bone-deep exhaustion. I managed to secure a spot on a lumpy futon in a cramped Bushwick apartment belonging to an old college acquaintance. She made it clear I could only stay for 1 week. The apartment was drafty and smelled faintly of mildew and cheap incense. I spent my days walking miles across the boroughs trying to stretch my dwindling cash. The sensory overload of the city battered my frayed nerves. Everywhere I walked, the distinct savory smell of Bodega chopped cheese sandwiches wrapped in foil drifted from corner stores. The rich scent of grilling meat and melting cheese tormented my empty stomach, but I refused to spend more than $3 a day on food. I lived on instant ramen and tap water, counting the remaining bills in my pocket every single night. On the morning of my 4th day, the lack of sleep and persistent hunger finally broke me. I walked into a small, brightly lit bodega on the corner of Myrtle Avenue, seeking refuge from the biting wind. The store was cramped aisles stacked high with canned goods and cleaning supplies. I approached the counter, shivering in my heavy coat, and asked the tired-looking clerk for a small, plain black coffee. I handed over my last few coins. The clerk, a man who looked just as exhausted as I felt, nodded and turned to the coffee machines. He filled a paper cup, secured the lid, and slid it across the scratched laminate counter. I took a sip, eager for the bitter warmth. The taste of artificial vanilla creamer and heavy sugar flooded my tongue. It was not black coffee. My frayed nerves simply snapped. The accumulated stress of the stolen savings, the freezing nights on a terrible futon, the relentless hunger and the lingering trauma of my mother's gold scissors all boiled over. I slammed the paper cup down on the counter. Hot liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the laminate. I yelled at the clerk, my voice harsh and irrational. I demanded to know why he could not follow a simple basic instruction. The clerk blinked in surprise, taking a step back from my sudden outburst. He raised his hands defensively, muttering a quiet apology and reaching for an empty cup to fix the mistake. But my anger blinded me. I gestured wildly toward the coffee machines, my hand colliding with a large glass sugar dispenser sitting on the edge of the counter. The heavy glass jar tipped over, falling toward the floor. It hit the dirty linoleum with a sharp crack, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. A mountain of white sugar poured out, mixing with the gray slush, and melted snow tracked in by morning customers. The sound of the breaking glass shattered my irrational rage. I stared down at the mess I had just created. The clerk looked at me, his expression shifting from surprise to profound pity. The fight drained out of my body, leaving behind a crushing wave of shame. My knees buckled. I dropped to the dirty floor of the bodega, right in the middle of the spilled sugar and broken glass. I burst into tears, sobbing loudly and pathetically. I muttered frantic apologies, my voice cracking, as I reached out with my bare hands, trying to sweep the wet, ruined sugar into a neat pile. Granules stuck to my palms, digging into my skin, along with tiny shards of glass. "I am so sorry," I choked out, tears dripping off my chin onto the filthy floor. "I am so sorry. I do not have any money to pay for the jar. I am sorry." The clerk walked around the counter holding a broom and a dustpan. He gently nudged my hands away from the broken glass, handing me a few paper napkins. He told me to stand up and not worry about the mess. He poured a fresh cup of black coffee and handed it to me, refusing to take any more money. I stumbled out of this bodega, clutching the hot paper cup, my chest heaving with lingering sobs. The freezing wind slapped my wet cheeks, serving as a harsh reminder of my reality. I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. My balance was in the double digits. My college acquaintance wanted me off her futon in 3 days. I could not survive another week like this. I stood on the noisy street corner, scrolling frantically through online job boards. I bypassed the standard retail applications. The background checks and payroll processing would take weeks to yield a paycheck. I needed cash immediately. I filtered the search results, looking for daily gigs, day labor, anything that paid out the same afternoon. Near the bottom of a forum, a vague posting caught my eye. An independent casting agency in Chelsea was seeking unconventional faces for an immediate avant-garde project. The description explicitly asked for subjects with unique raw features, paying a substantial day rate in cash upon completion of the shoot. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. For my entire life, my mother had taught me that my face was a liability. She told me my features were something to be hidden, concealed, and cropped out of the frame. The thought of stepping into a room full of fashion industry professionals, inviting their judgment, made my hands shake. But I looked down at my scuffed boots and thought about the $500 that was almost entirely gone. Hunger and desperation overpowered my deep-seated terror. I memorized the address in Chelsea, steeling myself for the brutal scrutiny I was about to walk into. The subway ride to Chelsea felt like a march toward a public execution. I huddled in the corner of the train car, checking my reflection in the dark window glass. Before leaving the drafty Bushwick apartment, I had spent 20 minutes applying a thick layer of drugstore concealer over my neck and jawline. It was a deeply ingrained habit. My mother Beatrice had taught me that survival depended on hiding the dark, jagged birthmark that painted the left side of my throat. She used to hand me heavy foundation compacts on my birthdays, presenting them as though they were gifts of love rather than tools of erasure. I carried her neuroses with me, blending the cheap makeup until my skin looked uniform, dull, and acceptable. Stepping out onto 10th Avenue, the freezing wind whipped my hair across my face. The address from the online forum led me to a nondescript industrial building tucked between a high-end art gallery and a disused loading dock. The elevator groaned as it carried me to the 4th-floor opening into a cavernous, raw loft space. The underground Chelsea gallery scene operated on a frequency I had never encountered in Connecticut. The air inside the loft was thick with the harsh chemical scent of developing fluid and burnt coffee. Unframed black and white prints hung from clotheslines strung across the exposed brick walls. Music thumped from a pair of blown-out speakers, a heavy rhythmic bass that rattled my teeth. Dozens of people milled around the staging area. They were intimidatingly striking. Tall, gaunt models with chopped hair and thrift store clothes draped over their frames, chatting with assistants holding clipboards. I hovered near the entrance, pulling my wool coat tighter around my waist. The urge to turn around and flee burned in my chest. I did not belong in this room. My thrifted clothes were worn out from days of wandering the city, and my boots were still scuffed from the spilled sugar at the bodega. But the heavy reality of my empty bank account pinned my feet to the floor. I walked to a folding table and scribbled my name on a sign in sheet. A production assistant with a shaved head called my name, pointing toward a makeshift dressing room sectioned off by black velvet curtains. Inside, the lighting was brilliant and unforgiving. A man stood near a cluster of light stands adjusting a camera lens. He wore a faded black t-shirt and had a smear of charcoal across his forearm. He introduced himself as Elias, the lead photographer. He did not offer a handshake. He simply stepped forward and scrutinized my face. His intense gaze tracked over my cheekbones, the harsh angle of my jaw, and settled directly on my neck. I instinctively raised my hand, trying to pull my coat collar up. The familiar shame clawed at my throat. I braced for the inevitable rejection, the polite dismissal telling me I did not fit the vision. Elias frowned. He turned over his shoulder and shouted for the makeup artist. A woman carrying a utility belt of brushes hurried over. "Scrub her neck," Elias ordered, pointing a finger at my throat. "Take all of that cheap paint off. Strip the face down to the base." Panic flared hot and sharp in my chest. I tried to step back, but the makeup artist was already pressing a damp makeup wipe against my skin. The cold moisture dissolved the thick layers of concealer I had meticulously applied. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling stripped naked under the blinding studio lights. The dark, irregular shape of my birthmark was exposed to the room. The sharp jut of my jawline, unsoftened by contouring, stood out starkly against the stark white backdrop. I felt physically sick. Beatrice's voice echoed in my head, telling me I invited pity, telling me I was a visual burden. Elias stepped back, framing my face with his hands. "Yes," he murmured, nodding rapidly. "That is it. The asymmetry, the mark. Do not cover that up. The harshness is the entire point." The blood drained from my head. My heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I looked at Elias and then at the makeup artist, who was smiling approvingly at my exposed skin. A dark, cynical certainty seized my mind. They were mocking me. This was a cruel, sophisticated joke. They wanted the ugly girl, the flawed outcast, to stand under their bright lights so they could photograph a freak show. The years of emotional conditioning from my family convinced me that nobody could ever look at my raw, unedited face and see anything other than a tragic mistake. "Do not make fun of me!" I snapped, my voice trembling with sudden fury. Elias paused, lowering his camera. "Excuse me." "You think this is funny?" I yelled, taking another step backward. I ripped the makeup wipe out of the artist's hand, throwing it onto the floor. "You bring people in here to laugh at them. I know what my face looks like. Do not treat me like an idiot." "Charlotte, wait." Elias started reaching a hand out, but I was already gone. I shoved past the velvet curtains, bursting back into the main loft. Heads turned to watch me, but I ignored them. I grabbed my heavy coat from a folding chair and stormed out of the studio, cursing under my breath. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me. I practically ran to the elevator, jamming my finger against the button until the carriage arrived. Have you ever run away from the exact thing you desperately wanted? I hit the street and took off, walking down 10th Avenue at a frantic, furious pace. My chest heaved, drawing in ragged gulps of the freezing city air. The wind lashed against my exposed birthmark, stinging my raw skin. I was furious at the photographer for his perceived cruelty, and furious at myself for being foolish enough to think I could secure a job in an industry built on aesthetics. I made it 2 full blocks down the avenue before the adrenaline began to evaporate. The cold reality of my situation crashed into me. I slowed to a halt, standing near a rusted bus stop enclosure. I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against the single remaining crumpled bill my father had given me. It was not enough to survive the week. I had no home, no backup plan, and no safety net. My pride was a worthless currency. I had just sabotaged a paying job because I was too deeply wounded to accept that someone might actually want to photograph the real version of me. A hot flush of profound embarrassment washed over my face. I squeezed my eyes closed, swallowing the bitter taste of my own trauma. I spun around on the concrete sidewalk. I ran. I sprinted back up 10th Avenue, my boots pounding against the pavement. My lungs burned with the icy air. Sweat prickled at my hairline despite the freezing temperature. I threw open the heavy door to the industrial building and jammed the elevator button, praying they had not already locked up. I burst back into the 4th-floor loft, breathless and panting. The music was still thumping. Elias was packing a lens into a padded case near the curtains. He looked up, raising a single skeptical eyebrow as I stumbled toward him. I stood there, chest heaving, my coat sliding off one shoulder. I swallowed my pride, bearing the urge to cry. "I am sorry," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "I am sorry I yelled at you. Please, I need this job. I will do whatever you need me to do. Please give me a second chance." Elias studied my flushed, sweating face for a long, agonizing moment. The corner of his mouth twitched into a faint smirk. He appreciated the desperation. He fed on the raw, unpolished energy of the city. "Get back under the lights," he said, pointing to the backdrop. The next 2 hours passed in a surreal, blinding haze. I stood in front of the lens, shivering slightly in a thin, draped garment. Elias did not tell me to smile. He did not tell me to soften my posture. He instructed me to lift my chin to expose the dark birthmark to the harsh illumination. The shutter clicked continuously, capturing the fierce, defensive glare I had built up over a lifetime of rejection. For the very first time, no one was trying to crop me out of the frame. The camera demanded my presence, and I gave it every ounce of pent-up frustration I possessed. When the chute wrapped the tension in my shoulders finally uncoiled, the crew migrated toward the back of the loft, pushing open a heavy window that led out onto a rusted iron fire escape. The bitter wind had died down, leaving a crisp, clear night over Chelsea. I sat on the cold metal grating, pulling my wool coat tightly around my knees. A lighting assistant handed me a plastic cup filled with lukewarm Pabst Blue Ribbon. I took a sip. The cheap beer tasted flat and metallic, but sitting there above the glowing grid of the city, I felt a strange, tentative sense of belonging. The scent of car exhaust and developing chemicals drifted in the night air. No one asked me where I came from or why I looked the way I did. Elias stepped out onto the fire escape, crouching down next to me. He handed me a thick white envelope containing a stack of crisp $20 bills. The day rate we agreed on. I clutched the money, feeling a staggering wave of relief. "You have a very lucrative look, Charlotte," he said, taking a drag from a cigarette. "I sent a few raw digital proofs to a commercial booking agent I know. She wants to sign you. It is a long-term campaign, real money." He pulled a folded legal document from his back pocket and tapped it against the iron railing. He handed it to me. My heart soared, soaring past the exhaustion and the fear. I unfolded the paper, staring at the official letterhead. It was a pathway out of poverty, a chance to build a concrete life without relying on the meager handouts of a cowardly father. But as I traced my finger over the dense blocks of legal text hiding within the fine print, a new, much more dangerous trap was waiting to spring shut. The morning after the Chelsea photo shoot, I sat at a sticky laminate table in a Brooklyn diner, nursing a bitter cup of black coffee. The white envelope Elias had handed me on the fire escape rested against my ceramic mug. It contained the cash I needed to survive the week and a folded legal document from a prominent commercial booking agency. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed the heavy paper flat against the table. I was reading a formal offer for representation. The initial terms seemed dazzling to a woman who had been stretching subway fare just days prior. They offered a substantial day rate for a luxury French fashion campaign. The brand wanted the raw, unedited look Elias had captured. It was a golden ticket out of poverty. Then I reached the third page. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of fine print buried under Section 8, subparagraph B. It was a perpetuity clause. The legal phrasing was dense, but the implication was brutal. By signing the agreement, I would grant the agency unrestricted ownership of my likeness across all future mediums, known or unknown, in perpetuity, for no additional compensation. They could plaster my face across a digital billboard in Tokyo, a magazine cover in Paris, or a pharmaceutical advertisement 50 years from now, and I would never see a single cent beyond my initial payment. It was a velvet trap designed to exploit starving artists who were too desperate to read the fine print. I uncapped my cheap ballpoint pen. The ink hovered a fraction of an inch above the dotted line on the signature page. My stomach grumbled, a hollow, aching reminder that I had no permanent roof over my head. If a contract asked for your soul, would you sign it just to succeed? I stared at the blank line, feeling the immense pressure of my empty bank account pushing down on my shoulders. Signing meant immediate cash. Refusing meant walking back out into the freezing wind with nothing but my pride. I capped the pen. I refused to let another entity own my identity. I had just escaped a mother who tried to tailor my existence to her liking. I was not about to hand my face over to a corporate board. 50 miles north in the wealthy coastal enclave of Westport, Beatrice was locked in a high-stakes negotiation of her own. She stood inside an exclusive temperature-controlled floral boutique on Main Street, wearing her signature camel hair coat. The shop smelled intensely of fresh eucalyptus and cold water. Beatrice tapped a manicured fingernail rhythmically against the glass display case, her posture rigid with irritation. The florist, a nervous young woman clutching an iPad, was trying to explain a supply chain issue. The specific shade of blush pink peonies Beatrice had ordered for Olivia's reception centerpieces was currently out of season and held up in international customs. Beatrice did not care about logistics. She viewed the absence of the correct flowers as a direct insult to her family legacy. She leaned over the counter, her tone dripping with quiet menace, threatening to pull the entire lucrative account and ruin the shop's reputation among the local country club set if the peonies did not arrive by the weekend. She treated the missing floral arrangements with a level of urgent maternal devotion she never extended to me. It had been weeks since I took the Metro North out of her life. She had not filed a missing persons report. She had not called the local hospitals. She had not even asked Julian if he knew where I went. I was a convenient ghost, a problem that had politely removed itself from her pristine narrative. Her panic and protective instincts were entirely reserved for maintaining a flawless visual presentation for her remaining guests. Back in Manhattan, I was enduring a very different kind of fight. I quickly learned that navigating the bureaucracy of New York commercial law required resources I did not possess. I spent 3 days searching for affordable representation before finding a pro bono legal aid clinic tucked into a cramped second-floor office in Midtown. The clinic was a chaotic sensory overload. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over peeling linoleum floors. The waiting room was packed with anxious tenants, fighting evictions and independent contractors chasing stolen wages. I waited 4 hours before being called back to a tiny, windowless office that smelled strongly of stale coffee and printer toner. My assigned lawyer was a man named David. He wore a wrinkled suit and spoke with a rapid-fire New York cadence that barely gave me room to breathe. He skimmed the agency contract with a yellow highlighter, slashing bright lines across the predatory clauses. "They are locking you into a universal buyout," he said without looking up. "It is standard predatory boilerplate for new faces. They know you are hungry, so they ask for the world. We strike Clause 8 entirely, or we walk away. They do not get to own your DNA for a few $1,000. What followed was a grueling 4-month ordeal. The agency lawyers postured intensely, relying on intimidation tactics to force my hand. They sent long, threatening emails to David dripping with corporate arrogance. They claimed I was a replaceable unknown. They issued exploding deadlines warning that the French luxury brand would simply find another model if I did not sign by the end of the business day. The stress of the ongoing legal battle bled into every aspect of my life. My initial cash ran out rapidly. To keep myself fed and pay for a tiny windowless room in Queens, I took a grueling under-the-table job washing dishes in the back of a commercial bakery. I spent my nights scrubbing hardened dough off industrial sheet pans, my hands raw and blistered, while my days were spent riding the subway to Midtown to sit in David's cramped office, reviewing yet another rejected Red Line agreement. By the 4th month, the relentless grind began to fracture my sanity. The agency sent over their 5th revision. It offered a slight increase in the day rate, but kept the core perpetuity clause intact, hiding it under newly convoluted legal jargon. I sat in the hard plastic chair across from David's cluttered desk, listening as he pointed out the hidden trap. The humid summer air conditioning in the clinic had broken, leaving the small room stifling and close. Something inside my chest simply snapped. The sheer exhaustion of poverty, the endless legal posturing, and the deep lingering trauma of my family's rejection converged into a tidal wave of profound frustration. I grabbed the heavy stapled contract off his desk, crushing the thick stock paper in my fists. My knuckles turned stark white. I hurled the balled-up documents across the small room. The paper hit a stack of legal volumes and scattered onto the dirty linoleum. "I am done!" I shouted, my voice cracking in a high, painful pitch. "I am finished with this. I cannot do it anymore." David stopped typing and looked at me. I buried my face in my raw, blistered hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears slipped through my fingers, dropping onto my jeans. My shoulders shook with the force of my breakdown. I told him I was too tired to survive this city. I threatened to quit the industry entirely and go back to scrubbing pans full-time because at least the bakery did not try to steal my identity. I was a weeping, frustrated mess, letting the reality of my brutal isolation conquer my pride. David did not offer me polite pity. He let me cry until my breathing slowed to a ragged hitch. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his messy desk. "They are stalling, Charlotte," he said, his tone steady and grounded. "They are playing a game of chicken because the French creative director specifically requested your face. The brand does not want a replacement. The agency is sweating right now. We hold the line." I wiped my nose with the back of my hand, staring at the crumpled contract on the floor. I forced myself to take a deep, shuddering breath, trusting the overworked lawyer who had fought for me harder in 4 months than my own parents had in 2 decades. We held the line. 2 grueling days later, the agency lawyers finally caved. They stripped the perpetuity clause from the agreement, conceding to a highly equitable licensing structure that protected my rights and offered substantial residuals for any future campaign usage. I signed the revised contract with a steady hand. The relief that washed over me was intoxicating, a hard-won victory over a system designed to crush the vulnerable. I had reclaimed my face. But the universe rarely allows a moment of peace to linger. Just as the ink dried on my new future, the heavy weight of my past found my doorstep. A thick, embossed envelope arrived in the mail at my Queens sublet, demanding my attention and threatening to pull me right back into the toxic orbit I had fought so fiercely to escape. I shoved the heavy embossed wedding invitation into the back of my desk drawer without opening it. There was no room in my brain for my family today. The morning marked the beginning of my new life. The luxury French fashion house had finalized their global campaign and selected me as their lead muse. I expected a plush, climate-controlled studio filled with catering tables and warm robes. Instead, my call sheet directed me to a pop-up trailer parked in the middle of a brutal Manhattan winter storm. A severe weather advisory had been issued hours earlier. Sleet pelted the metal roof of the makeup trailer as I sat in a swivel chair. The creative director wanted an aesthetic that stripped away every trace of conventional prettiness. The makeup artist coated my eyebrows in a harsh chemical bleach that burned my skin. Once the dark hair faded to a pale, invisible blonde, she pulled my own hair back into a painfully tight bun plastered to my skull with thick gel. I stared into the lighted mirror and barely recognized the reflection. The girl who grew up shrinking in Connecticut was gone. Without my eyebrows to soften my expression, my face looked alien and predatory. My sharp jawline and the dark, irregular birthmark on my neck anchored my features, commanding the space. It was the antithesis of the soft pastel beauty my mother worshipped. I looked like a creature built for survival. 50 miles north, my mother sat in the warm, ambient glow of the Westport Yacht Club. The dining room smelled of expensive gin and roasted cedar. Beatrice occupied a prime corner table surrounded by 3 women from her social circle. She sipped her cocktail, projecting the flawless, wealthy image she spent her entire life defending. Draped elegantly around her shoulders was a heavy silk scarf. The intricate geometric logo woven into the fabric belonged to the exact French fashion house, paying me thousands of dollars that very morning. Beatrice ran her manicured fingers over the expensive silk, relying on the designer label to broadcast the status she was terrified of losing. She leaned forward, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper to brag about my sister. "Olivia just understands true elegance," Beatrice purred to her friends. "Her wedding arrangements are impeccable. She has such a refined eye. It is a relief, honestly. You try to raise your children with a certain standard, but some people simply lack polish." She swirled the ice in her glass, dismissing my existence with a casual flick of her wrist. She believed she had successfully hidden her shameful, unpolished daughter from the world. She had no idea her friends were staring at a scarf produced by a brand that was currently building a global campaign around my unhidden flaws. Back in the city, the door to the makeup trailer swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. A production assistant handed me a sheer avant-garde gown constructed from layers of stiff black tulle and metallic hardware. It offered zero protection against the plunging temperatures. I stepped out onto the cobblestones of a narrow alleyway in Tribeca. The nor'easter was raging. Sleet blew sideways, stinging my bare shoulders and collarbone like tiny needles. The production crew swarmed the alley, bundled in heavy insulated parkas and thick wool scarves. I stood in the center of the chaos wearing next to nothing. Thick plumes of white steam billowed up from the orange and white-striped Con Edison subway grates set into the pavement. The hot steam clashed with the freezing air, creating a thick cinematic fog. The chaotic blaring of yellow cabs bled in from Broadway, echoing off the tall brick buildings. The French creative director shouted instructions over the roaring wind, demanding raw, unfiltered grit. I stepped onto my mark, shivering uncontrollably. My teeth rattled together. The frozen cobblestones pierced through the thin soles of my designer stilettos. The camera lens pointed directly at me, capturing every micro-expression. Have you ever felt like a massive fraud during your biggest win? I stood in the center of a high-budget luxury production, but my mind played cruel tricks on me. The freezing rain soaked into my tulle dress, dragging it down. The old insecurities whispered in my ear, telling me I was just a desperate girl playing dress-up. I felt like the same weeping mess who dropped her wallet on the sticky train floor. The sheer terror of being discovered as an imposter gripped my chest tighter than the freezing wind. I was supposed to embody fierce high fashion, but under the blinding strobe lights, I just felt cold, small, and entirely out of my depth. "Move forward!" the director shouted, waving his hands. "Give me danger! Give me hunger!" I locked my jaw and forced my frozen legs to move. I stepped out of the billowing steam, pushing my shoulders back. I tried to channel the anger I felt toward Beatrice, using the rejection to fuel my expression. My stiletto heel slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin layer of slush. My ankle rolled hard. I lost my balance, pitching forward toward the frozen concrete curb. I threw my hands out to catch myself, but the momentum carried me down. My knee slammed into the jagged, icy edge of the sidewalk. The sheer designer tights tore open instantly. A sharp burning pain flared up my shin as blood mixed with the dirty, freezing slush. The entire crew gasped, taking a collective step forward. The pristine illusion of the high fashion shoot vanished. The pain and the freezing cold snapped my remaining patience. The instinct to maintain a poised, graceful facade evaporated. I scrambled to my feet, my face burning with fierce heat despite the storm. I let out a loud, sharp curse that echoed off the brick walls, cutting through the noise of the traffic. I looked down at my bleeding knee and the ruined tights. A profound, unedited rage boiled over. I turned and kicked a nearby metal trash can with my uninjured leg. The heavy bin toppled over, clattering loudly down the alley and spilling empty coffee cups into the sleet. I sounded ridiculous. I was a grown woman throwing a loud, messy tantrum in the middle of a luxury set. I stood there panting, my chest heaving, glaring at the overturned trash can, while the crew stared at me in stunned silence. A styling assistant wrapped in a thick puffer coat let out a long, heavy sigh. She stepped carefully over the ice, holding a first aid kit and a fresh pair of tights. She did not offer pity. She just handed me a frozen wet wipe and nudged me toward a dry patch of pavement. "Get it out of your system," she muttered, dabbing the scraped skin on my knee. "We are losing the light." I stood there, dripping wet, bleeding, and thoroughly embarrassed. I wiped the mixture of sleet and tears from my cheek, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The tantrum drained the imposter syndrome away, leaving only a raw, stubborn need to finish the job. I changed the torn garments in a cramped pop-up tent and marched back out into the punishing wind. I found my mark over the steaming grate. The anger from the fall, the biting cold, and the lingering sting of the wedding invitation sitting in my desk drawer fused together. I stared down the barrel of the camera lens, dropping every defense mechanism I had ever built. I stopped trying to look pretty. I let the camera capture the hungry, scarred survivor beneath the makeup. The shutter fired in rapid succession. The director shouted his approval, his voice rising over the storm. We captured the image that would soon tower over the city. An hour later, I sat in the heated trailer peeling the damp, heavy tulle off my freezing skin. The adrenaline that fueled the performance slowly seeped out of my muscles, leaving me drained and hollow. As I reached for a towel to wipe the harsh bleach from my eyebrows, a strange burning sensation began to spread across my throat. I scratched at the skin right above my collarbone. It was not the fading sting of the sleet. A deep, relentless itch radiated outward, centering perfectly over my dark birthmark. I looked into the brightly lit mirror, tracing my fingers over the sensitive area. The skin felt hot and rough to the touch. The physical toll of the grueling contract negotiations, the freezing temperatures, and the buried anxiety about my family was demanding a toll. My body was sounding a loud, unavoidable alarm, setting the stage for a biological rebellion that threatened to tear down my hard-won victory just as it was beginning. The burning sensation that started in the makeup trailer did not fade overnight. It festered. 2 weeks before the French luxury campaign was slated to launch, I woke up in my cramped Queens sublet with my fingernails digging into my own throat. The morning light filtered through the dusty window blinds, casting long shadows across the bare mattress. My heart hammered a frantic, erratic rhythm. I threw off the tangled blankets and stumbled toward the tiny bathroom. I flipped the switch. The harsh overhead fluorescent bulb flickered to life, buzzing with a low electrical hum. I leaned over the stained porcelain sink and stared into the smudged mirror. A sprawling, angry red rash covered the entire left side of my neck. It was a severe eczema outbreak radiating outward in raised, inflamed patches. The epicenter of the reaction sat perfectly over my dark birthmark. The very feature the avant-garde photographer had championed, the exact physical trait the brand was building their global marketing strategy around, was now buried under cracked, weeping skin. Has your own body ever betrayed you right before the finish line? I gripped the edges of the sink, my knuckles turning stark white. The timing was a cruel, calculated joke played by my own nervous system. The campaign launch coincided with the exact week of Olivia's upcoming wedding in Connecticut. The combined psychological weight of waiting for my face to be broadcast to the world while simultaneously dreading the inevitable confrontation with my estranged family had pushed my immune system past its breaking point. This was not just a cosmetic inconvenience, it was a potential financial catastrophe. The hard-fought contract I spent months negotiating contained a strict appearance clause. As the lead muse, I was required to maintain my physical presentation for upcoming promotional events and potential secondary shoots. If the creative director saw my neck resembling a raw burn victim, they could invoke a breach of contract. The agency could terminate my representation, pull the residual payments, and demand the return of my initial advance. The security I bled for was evaporating right in front of the mirror. I threw on an oversized hooded sweatshirt, zipping it up to my chin. I shoved my feet into a pair of worn sneakers and bolted out the door. The morning air was sharp and unyielding. I took the subway into Manhattan, surfacing into the chaotic noise of 6th Avenue. The sidewalks teemed with hurried commuters, dodging delivery carts and scaffolding. I kept my head down, hiding my inflamed throat beneath the heavy cotton fabric. I spent the next 4 hours bouncing between overpriced Manhattan urgent care clinics. Navigating the city healthcare system without premium insurance is a soul-crushing endurance test. The first clinic demanded an exorbitant upfront fee just to sit in the waiting room. I paid it, handing over a significant chunk of my remaining campaign advance. I sat in a stiff plastic chair in a sterile waiting area that smelled of industrial hand sanitizer and stale rain. Sirens wailed relentlessly outside, echoing off the towering glass skyscrapers and vibrating through the clinic windows. A man coughing harshly sat 2 chairs down, reading a discarded tabloid. The receptionist behind a thick sheet of smudged plexiglass typed lethargically on her keyboard, treating my panic with the bored indifference unique to New York medical staff. When I finally saw a doctor, the consultation lasted less than 5 minutes. The physician, a tired-looking woman in a wrinkled lab coat, glanced at my neck and scribbled a prescription for a high-dose topical steroid. She delivered the diagnosis in a flat monotone. It was a stress-induced flare-up. She told me the inflammation would eventually subside, but it would take time. The skin needed days, perhaps weeks, to heal. I tried to explain the urgency. I told her I had a career-defining obligation in a matter of days. I needed a fast solution, a shot, an injection, anything to calm the angry red welts. She offered a sympathetic sigh and told me biology does not adhere to corporate deadlines. I left the clinic clutching the small tube of prescription cream. The sirens on 6th Avenue continued their chaotic chorus, blending with the roaring engines of passing buses. I felt entirely untethered. My mother Beatrice used to tell me my flaws would ruin any chance I had at a normal life. Standing on the crowded Manhattan pavement, I feared she was right. My trauma was no longer just a mental burden. It had manifested physically threatening to tear down the walls of the sanctuary I was trying to build. I returned to my sublet as the afternoon sun faded into a gray dusk. The silence of the empty apartment pressed down on my shoulders. I retreated to the small, cramped bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the water run until the room filled with steam. I climbed into the porcelain tub, fully clothed in a t-shirt and underwear. The warm water hit my shoulders, soaking through the cotton fabric. I uncapped the tiny tube of steroid cream and tried to apply it to my neck. The ointment stung, hitting the raw, open patches of eczema. The pain triggered a fresh wave of unbearable itching. It was a deep, maddening sensation crawling beneath the surface of my skin. I dropped the tube. It clattered against the porcelain tub, washing toward the drain. I raised my hands to my throat, intending to just press my palms against the heat, but the lack of control broke my remaining resolve. I lost the battle. My fingernails dug into my own neck, scratching fiercely at the inflamed patches. The brief, fleeting relief of the friction gave way to intense, stinging pain. I could not stop. I sat under the falling water, clawing at my own skin, destroying the fragile healing process the doctor had prescribed. Tears mixed with the shower water streaming down my face. I sobbed loudly, my voice echoing off the damp-tiled walls. I was a weeping, terrified mess, destroying my own face because the pressure was simply too much to bear. I felt the familiar suffocating weight of my childhood settling over my chest. I was convinced that my entire future was crumbling because I could not regulate my own anxiety. The fashion house would drop me. The agency would drop me. I would end up back on the Metro North, a broken failure, crawling back to a family that did not want me. I pulled my hands away from my throat. My fingernails were lined with tiny traces of blood. I curled into a tight ball on the floor of the tub, letting the hot water rain down on my shaking shoulders. The physical pain throbbed in rhythm with my erratic heartbeat. I stayed there until the hot water tank emptied, turning the spray to a freezing, biting cold. Shivering, I crawled out of the tub and stripped off the heavy, wet clothes. I wrapped myself in a thin towel and stood in front of the mirror once more. The eczema was worse now, angry and bleeding slightly at the edges. I carefully patted the area dry, wincing at every touch. I retrieved the discarded tube of cream from the tub and applied a thick layer over the damage, forcing myself to endure the burning sting. I walked into the main room and collapsed onto the edge of my mattress. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up, displaying a text from the agency confirming the final dates for the campaign launch. The digital billboard was scheduled to go live in a matter of days. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling. My skin burned. My career hung in a fragile, precarious balance. I needed to focus on healing my neck. I needed to block out every source of stress to give the medication a chance to work. But as I turned my head, my eyes landed on my desk drawer. Inside that drawer sat the heavy embossed wedding invitation I had shoved away days ago. The yellow sticky note dictating my role as coat check staff haunted me. I tried to ignore it, but the upcoming collision between my secret life in New York and the suffocating reality of Connecticut was accelerating. The billboard was imminent. The wedding was looming. I had to face the very people causing this physical breakdown, and I was running out of places to hide. The cold Manhattan rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the memory. Standing in Times Square, holding the heavy embossed envelope, my mind finally snapped back to the present moment. My neck still carried the faint pink scarring from the eczema outbreak, a permanent reminder of the toll this campaign demanded. The massive digital billboard flashed above me, broadcasting my bleached eyebrows and sharp jawline to the world. But looking down at my phone, the glowing screen offered a much harsher reality. Olivia's selfie posted just hours ago proved my family remained entirely blind to my existence. She stood grinning, holding a martini directly beneath the 50-foot projection of my face. Her caption, "NYC Aesthetic Goals," reduced my career-defining achievement to a convenient background prop for her bachelorette weekend. I shoved the phone into my pocket and focused my attention on the wedding invitation in my other hand. The envelope was crafted from thick, textured cardstock, the kind favored by elite Connecticut event planners who charge exorbitant fees just for the consultation. The return address listed a prestigious venue near Mystic Seaport, a location known for its nautical wealth, historic sailing ships, and traditional New England clam bakes. My mother Beatrice loved Mystic. It represented the old-money coastal aesthetic she spent her life trying to emulate. I slid my thumb under the heavy wax seal, cracking it open. The invitation itself was beautiful, a pristine arrangement of elegant calligraphy announcing the union of my sister Olivia to a man named Preston. The reception promised an evening of waterfront dining and champagne toasts. It was an event designed to impress the exact country club circle my mother worshipped. Then I flipped the card over. Adhered to the pristine white backing was a bright yellow sticky note. The stark neon color clashed aggressively with the formal presentation. My mother's neat cursive handwriting filled the small square space. The message was brief, devoid of any warmth or maternal affection. Charlotte, we expect you to arrive early. Please manage the guest book during the cocktail hour. Afterward, report to the rear tent to handle the coat check for the evening guests. Do not take a seat at the main family tables. There is a vendor meal arranged for you near the kitchen. Keep out of sight during the professional photos. Beatrice, how would you respond to an invitation that is actually just a chore list? I peeled the sticky note off the expensive cardstock, the adhesive tearing away a tiny fiber of the paper. A fresh wave of bitter resentment flooded my chest, pushing past the awe of the billboard towering above me. For 5 years, I had lived in exile, scraping by in Brooklyn diners, fighting predatory contracts and surviving physical breakdowns. I had built a life on my own terms. I had become the literal face of a luxury global campaign. Yet to Beatrice, I was still the unpolished flaw she needed to hide. She did not invite me to celebrate my sister's marriage. She summoned me to serve as unpaid labor, keeping me out of the frame, just as she had done with the holiday cards. The audacity of the demand ignited a dark, reckless anger. I turned away from the bright lights of Times Square and descended into the subway, navigating the damp concrete stairs with heavy steps. The train ride back to my Queens sublet felt interminably long. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks fueled the mounting fury in my head. They thought I was still the broken girl crying on the sticky floor of the Metro North. They had no idea I was about to walk into that nautical reception wearing the armor of a woman who stared down a high-fashion camera lens in a freezing storm. I unlocked the door to my apartment, throwing the wet wool coat onto a chair. My small kitchen counter held a half-empty bottle of cheap red wine I had purchased from the corner Bodega earlier that week. I bypassed a glass, grabbing the bottle directly by the neck. I took a long, burning pull, the harsh liquid scraping down my throat. I paced the cramped length of the living room, the wine warming my blood, lowering the barriers of my self-control. The yellow sticky note sat on the counter mocking me. A vendor meal, managing the coat check, keeping out of sight. I grabbed my phone, unlocking the screen with slightly clumsy fingers. I opened my contacts, scrolling past photographers and agents, until I found the number I had not dialed in years. Olivia, the golden child, the sister who took selfies under my face without recognizing me. I pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before dropping to her automated voicemail. The cheerful, overly enthusiastic recording of her voice instructing callers to leave a message grated on my frayed nerves. The beep sounded. I did not pause to think. I did not draft a calculated response. I let the cheap wine and years of suppressed rage take the wheel. Olivia. I slurred my voice, pitching loud and unsteady in the empty apartment. You are a vapid, oblivious idiot. You took a picture under my face today. My face. And you did not even notice because you were too busy looking at your own reflection. I took a shaky breath, pacing faster. And tell Beatrice I read her little note. You want me to run the coat check. You want me to eat a vendor meal by the kitchen while you play dress-up in Mystic. You are both completely pathetic. You spend your whole lives pretending to be perfect, and you are just hollow. You are nothing but cheap aesthetic garbage. The words spilled out a torrent of unedited bitter venom. I felt a fleeting rush of vindication tearing down the golden child. But as I drew breath for another insult, the reality of what I was doing slammed into me. I was drunk, yelling into a phone, sounding exactly like the unhinged, unstable outcast my mother always claimed I was. I was handing them the very ammunition they needed to justify my exclusion. Panic seized my chest instantly, sobering me up. My thumb scrambled across the screen, frantically jabbing the red end call button. The line went dead. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the room, staring at the glowing screen. The voicemail had sent. "Oh my God," I whispered, the heat draining from my face. No, no, no. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I dropped the wine bottle onto the counter, ignoring the heavy thud. I grabbed my laptop, tearing it open, and frantically searching the internet for ways to delete a sent voicemail. My hands shook as I typed, navigating through obscure forums and carrier support pages. The results were unanimous and devastating. Once a message is recorded on the recipient server, it cannot be retracted. I spent the next hour pacing the apartment, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm. I chewed nervously on my thumbnail, visualizing Olivia playing the message for Beatrice. I could hear my mother's cold, indifferent voice dismissing me. "See, I told you she is disturbed. It is a good thing we hit her in the back." I had given them exactly what they wanted. I had lost my temper and surrendered my dignity. The triumphant armor I felt standing under the billboard evaporated, leaving a terrified, humiliated girl in its wake. I sat on the edge of my mattress, burying my face in my hands. The physical manifestation of my anxiety returned a faint, familiar itch, blooming along the scarred skin of my neck. I needed to fix this. I could not let that drunken voicemail be the final word. I could not let them define my narrative again. The wedding was in 3 days. I had to travel to Connecticut. I had to walk into the heart of their nautical illusion and face them directly. I needed to prove that the erratic voice on the phone was not the reality of the woman I had become. But venturing back into Beatrice's domain meant walking onto a battlefield where she controlled all the rules. I was preparing to return to the coastal towns that demanded aesthetic perfection, armed only with my hidden success and a deep, lingering fear that returning home would shatter my fragile new identity. The stage was set for a brutal family reunion, and the collision course I set in motion was about to pull me back into the very trap I nearly died escaping. The anxiety of the sent voicemail clung to me like a heavy, damp blanket for the next 3 days. I ignored every call from unknown numbers, assuming each ring was Beatrice preparing to eviscerate me over the phone. But the anticipated attack never arrived. The silence from Connecticut was unnerving, a quiet vacuum that left my imagination to conjure the worst possible scenarios. I packed a small duffel bag, carefully folding the expensive tailored dress the agency had gifted me for promotional events. I did not pack the heavy yellow sticky note, but its instructions were burned into my memory. Guest book, coat check, vendor meal, keep out of sight. I took the Metro North out of Grand Central, retracing the exact path of my escape 5 years prior. The industrial sprawl of the city gave way to the familiar coastal wealth of Fairfield County. The train doors opened in Westport, delivering me into the crisp autumn air. The salty, distinct smell of the Long Island Sound hit my senses immediately, a sharp contrast to the exhaust and concrete of New York. The town remained identical to my memories. Aggressively manicured hedges lined the driveways of massive colonial homes, standing like green fortresses guarding the perfection inside. I ordered a rideshare to my parents' house, bracing for a brutal confrontation. I envisioned Beatrice standing on the front porch, brandishing her phone, demanding an explanation for the drunken voicemail. I rehearsed my defensive lines, tightening my jaw and lifting my chin exactly as Elias had instructed me during the freezing Tribeca shoot. The car pulled up the long, familiar gravel driveway. The house looked pristine, decorated for the upcoming nuptials, with understated, elegant floral arrangements flanking the entryway. I hoisted my duffel bag over my shoulder, taking a deep, steadying breath before pushing the heavy front door open. I stepped into the foyer, dropping my bag onto the polished hardwood. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and expensive beeswax candles. My mother Beatrice stood near the kitchen island, wearing a crisp white button-down and cashmere slacks. She turned around, holding a stack of pristine linen napkins. I froze, planting my feet, ready for the shouting to begin. Beatrice stopped, wiping her hands on a nearby towel. She did not scowl. She did not mention the voicemail. Her eyes swept over my frame, tracking the sharp angles of my collarbone and the hollows of my cheeks, features that had secured my luxury modeling contract but looked alarmingly gaunt to a suburban mother. A genuine, unscripted look of alarm crossed her face. The severe critical mask she usually wore slipped, revealing a sudden raw maternal panic. "Charlotte," she gasped, taking a quick step forward. "Good God, you look skeletal. Are you eating anything down in that city? You look like you are starving." I blinked, thrown entirely off balance by the reaction. Her voice lacked the usual venomous bite. It was laced with an actual frantic concern. She bypassed the tension of my arrival, rushing toward the large stainless steel refrigerator. "Sit down," she ordered, gesturing frantically to a stool at the marble island. "You are wasting away." I ordered a pie from Sally's. It just got delivered. "Sit down and eat something warm immediately." She pulled a large, grease-stained cardboard box onto the counter, flipping the lid open. The rich, smoky aroma of charred New Haven-style pizza filled the kitchen. It was my favorite meal growing up, a distinct Connecticut staple characterized by its thin, blistered crust and tangy tomato sauce. Beatrice never kept greasy takeout in the house, treating it like a culinary sin. Yet here she was, aggressively sliding a large hot slice onto a ceramic plate. She set the plate directly in front of me, pushing a glass of water across the marble. "Eat," she demanded, her hands hovering nervously near the plate, as if she wanted to feed me herself. "You look so frail, Charlotte. You cannot survive on whatever they are feeding you down there." I stared at the slice of pizza. The charred crust perfectly blistered the cheese, melting in the center. A confusing, heavy warmth bloomed in my chest. This was the mother I had spent 28 years craving. A mother who noticed I was struggling. A mother who prioritized my physical well-being over a flawless aesthetic. For 5 years I had hardened my heart, convincing myself she was incapable of care. But seeing her stand there, genuinely distressed by my thin frame, shattered the simple, villainous narrative I had built around her. "Do you ever sabotage a peaceful moment because of your past trauma?" I looked up at Beatrice, her blue eyes wide with a strange, desperate kind of worry. The red herring was perfectly executed. The universe was offering me a glimpse of domestic peace, a quiet moment of maternal affection that could potentially bridge the massive chasm between us. I wanted to take a bite. I wanted to sit in the warm kitchen and pretend the holiday cards, the gold scissors, and the yellow sticky note never existed. But the thick, unyielding wall of my trauma rejected the peace. My brain, conditioned by decades of emotional manipulation, immediately searched for the trap. The sudden warmth felt dangerous, a calculated maneuver to lower my defenses before delivering the real punishment. The drunken voicemail echoed loudly in my mind. She was ignoring my angry words, treating me like a fragile, incompetent child who needed saving rather than a successful adult who had commanded a Times Square billboard. The warm feeling in my chest curdled into a sudden violent defense mechanism. The vulnerability she exposed in me felt like a weakness I could not afford to show. I shoved the ceramic plate hard across the marble island. The plate screeched against the stone, stopping just short of the edge. "I do not want your pity pizza." "Beatrice," I snapped, my voice rising harsh and defensive. Beatrice flinched, taking a startled step back. "Charlotte, what is wrong with you? I am just trying to feed you. You look terribly thin. Do not act like you care about my health," I yelled, my anger escalating rapidly, entirely out of proportion to the situation. "You did not care when you cropped me out of your life. You did not care when you sent me a chore list instead of a wedding invitation. Do not pretend you are some worried mother now just because I do not fit your healthy suburban aesthetic." The genuine concern on Beatrice's face hardened instantly, retreating behind the familiar icy walls of her social armor. She drew herself up, smoothing the front of her white blouse. The maternal panic vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating matriarch I knew so well. "I am trying to offer a basic kindness to my daughter who arrived looking like a stray dog," she said, her tone dropping to that dangerous, controlled register. "But clearly the city has stripped you of whatever manners you had left." "I am not a stray dog," I shouted, gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. "I am doing fine. I am doing better than fine. You just cannot stand that I survived without your pristine little rules." I was yelling, acting like a volatile, dramatic teenager, throwing a temper tantrum over a slice of pizza. I was actively destroying the rare moment of peace, desperately trying to regain control by burning the kitchen down around me. I proved her assessment correct. I was behaving like an unpolished, erratic problem that needed to be managed. Beatrice picked up the ceramic plate, dumping the hot slice of pizza back into the cardboard box. She closed the lid with a definitive snap, dismissing the conversation entirely. "If you are quite finished with this outburst," she said, turning her back to me to wipe the counter, "your sister will be arriving shortly with her bridal party. I suggest you go upstairs and make yourself presentable. The rehearsal dinner begins at 7, and I will not have you causing a scene in front of the groom's family." I stood there, my chest heaving, the scent of the charred crust lingering in the air, mocking my empty stomach. I had successfully sabotaged the interaction, allowing my defensive instincts to ruin any chance of a truce. The brief illusion of a caring mother was gone, replaced by the reality of a rigid schedule and impending social obligations. I grabbed my duffel bag from the floor, the heavy strap digging into my shoulder. I marched up the stairs to my old bedroom, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of the house settling over my lungs. I had driven 50 miles to face them armed with my hidden success, but in 5 minutes Beatrice had reduced me to a screaming child. I threw my bag onto the bed, staring at the floral wallpaper that had remained unchanged for a decade. The rehearsal dinner was looming. I needed to pull myself together to put on the tailored dress and attend the event without letting my chaotic emotions betray me again. I assumed the dinner would be a quiet endurance test, a few hours of hiding in the background while Olivia soaked up the attention. I had no idea that Beatrice's brief display of maternal concern was not a genuine evolution, but a highly calculated setup for a public humiliation that would strike at the very core of my deepest insecurities, leaving me completely exposed in front of the elite society I despised. The stifling air of my childhood bedroom felt heavy, thick with unresolved tension. I unzipped my duffel bag, intending to retrieve the expensive tailored dress the agency had provided. A sharp rap on my door interrupted me. Beatrice stepped into the room holding a garment bag draped over her arm. Her expression was neutral, scrubbed clean of the maternal panic she displayed in the kitchen earlier. "Put this on," she commanded, hanging the plastic bag on the closet door. "It is a spare bridesmaid's dress. Lauren developed food poisoning this morning and dropped out of the bridal party. You need to fill the empty space for the symmetry of the rehearsal photos." I stared at the garment bag. The red herring evaporated instantly. Her sudden concern over my weight in the kitchen had nothing to do with my health. It was a panicked realization that her emergency backup prop might look too gaunt to fit into the sample-size dress. She wanted me fed solely to fill out the bodice properly, ensuring her visual aesthetic remained uninterrupted by a missing bridesmaid. "I want you in the back row," Beatrice added, avoiding my gaze as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "Stand behind Julian. Do not draw attention to yourself. We just need a warm body to balance the frame. Once the professional photos are finished, you are free to change back and begin organizing the coat check tags for tomorrow." She turned and left the room without waiting for a response. My hands clenched into tight fists. I was not a guest. I was not family. I was a structural necessity, a piece of human scaffolding required to maintain the symmetry of her precious photographs. I pulled the dress from the bag. It was a pale seafoam green, a color that violently clashed with my sharp features and dark birthmark. I slipped it on, feeling the stiff satin constrict my ribs. I applied my own makeup, leaving my jawline unsoftened, and my birthmark exposed a silent, defiant protest against her demands. The rehearsal dinner was hosted at the Westport Yacht Club, a highly exclusive venue perched on the edge of the Long Island Sound. The sprawling mahogany deck overlooked a marina filled with sleek sailboats. Inside the dining room smelled of expensive catered salmon and the sharp juniper scent of countless gin and tonics. The guest list consisted of old-money Connecticut families mingling effortlessly in pastel Vineyard Vines sweaters and tailored navy blazers. The room hummed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low melodic cadence of wealthy, polite conversation. I stood near the edge of the room, gripping a glass of sparkling water. Olivia fluttered through the crowd, glowing in a white silk cocktail dress, clinging to the arm of her fiancé, Preston. Preston was a junior partner at a Boston firm, inheriting his wealth and his arrogance in equal measure. He possessed the kind of loud, oblivious confidence that only generational money provides. About an hour into the event, the hired photographer, a man wearing a black turtleneck and holding an expensive DSLR camera, called for the immediate family to gather near the large stone fireplace. "All right, let us get the core group," he announced, waving his hand toward the hearth. "Parents of the bride center. Siblings flank them. Let us make this look natural." I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the fireplace. Julian stood stiffly near the mantel, offering me a quick, nervous glance before focusing his attention firmly on the camera lens. Olivia positioned herself dead center, radiant and beaming. I took my assigned place in the back row, stepping up onto the small raised hearth to ensure I was visible behind my father. I lifted my chin, refusing to shrink away. I prepared to stare down the lens, ready to exist in the family record, even if it was just as a backup bridesmaid. Beatrice moved to her spot in front of me. As the photographer raised his camera, preparing to focus the shot, Beatrice shifted her weight. She took a deliberate, exaggerated half-step backward and to the right. I felt the soft cashmere of her sweater brush against my seafoam dress. I looked down. Her shoulder was squarely positioned in front of my chest. She tilted her head slightly, raising her chin to an angle that effectively blocked the lower half of my face. She actively used her own body as a physical barrier, eclipsing my presence from the camera's view. Have you ever lost your words in the exact moment you needed them most? The blood roared in my ears, a rushing, overwhelming tide of absolute boiling anger. It was not a digital crop or a manual scissor cut this time. It was a live physical erasure happening in front of a room full of people. She was literally standing in my way, ensuring the lens captured the pristine mother and the golden bride, while keeping the flawed, unpolished daughter safely hidden behind her cashmere armor. I stared at the back of her perfectly styled hair. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I needed to say something. I needed to deliver a sharp, cutting remark that would expose her cruelty to the entire room. I needed to act like the woman who commanded a Times Square billboard. "Move," I tried to say, but my throat was painfully dry. I opened my mouth to demand she step aside to announce my presence to the photographer, but the words tangled on my tongue. The crushing weight of the public setting the presence of the wealthy guests and the decades of conditioning paralyzed my vocal cords. You are standing," I stammered, my voice cracking in a high pitch. "Beatrice, you are blocking." Beatrice did not turn around. She maintained her wide, practiced smile for the camera, whispering over her shoulder through clenched teeth. "Keep your voice down, Charlotte. Stop fidgeting and hold still." I stepped awkwardly to the left, trying to find a gap in her posture, but she mirrored my movement, swaying her torso just enough to maintain the block. You cannot just..." I sputtered, my face burning with a hot, humiliating flush. "Stop standing in front of me. I am supposed to be in the picture." I sounded like an angry, petulant teenager throwing a tantrum over a spot in a school photo. I tripped over my words, incapable of projecting any authority. The powerful, commanding muse I had become in New York vanished, entirely replaced by a stuttering, panicked girl. The photographer clicked the shutter 3 times in rapid succession, oblivious to the silent battle happening in the back row. "Got it," he cheerfully announced, lowering the camera. "Beautiful family. Thank you, everyone." The group immediately dispersed. Olivia dragged Preston toward the bar, laughing loudly at a joke he made. Julian scurried away, disappearing into a conversation with Preston's father. Beatrice turned to face me, finally dropping her smile. Her eyes swept over my flushed, frustrated face with cold, clinical satisfaction. "That concludes your obligations for the evening," she said, her tone brisk and dismissive. "You can go change out of that dress now. The coat check tags are in a box near the front entrance. Make sure they are organized numerically before the main reception tomorrow." She turned on her heel and walked away, mingling seamlessly back into the crowd of pastel sweaters and crystal glasses. I stood alone near the stone fireplace, my hands trembling with unspent adrenaline. The seafoam dress felt like a straitjacket. I had let her win again. I had lost my voice at the exact moment I needed it, allowing her to physically erase me without putting up a coherent fight. The boiling anger in my chest turned inward, morphing into a heavy, suffocating shame. I needed to get out of that room. The noise of the clinking glasses and the polite, wealthy laughter grated against my frayed nerves. I pushed through the swinging doors leading to the club's kitchen, ignoring the confused stares of the catering staff. I bypassed the main hallway, slipping out a side exit that led toward the parking lot. I found my rideshare and sat in the back seat the entire way to my parents' house, staring blankly at the dark, passing trees. The anger receded, leaving a cold, hollow void. I was a ghost in my own family, a temporary prop utilized for symmetry and then quickly discarded to perform manual labor. I entered the silent, empty house, the quiet rooms offering no comfort. I needed a distraction, a place to sit quietly until the racing thoughts slowed down. I bypassed the stairs leading to my old bedroom, drifting instead toward Julian's home study on the first floor. It was the only room in the house Beatrice rarely entered, avoiding the faint smell of damp cedar and stale pipe tobacco that clung to the leather furniture. I stepped into the dark study, flipping on a small brass reading lamp. I planned to sit in the worn leather armchair and stare at the wall until the exhaustion overtook my anger. But the universe had a different plan. I moved toward an outlet to plug in my phone charger, and my knee accidentally bumped the edge of a heavy oak filing cabinet. A loud clatter echoed in the quiet room. The bottom drawer unlatched, sliding open on its metal tracks. I knelt down intending to push the drawer shut, but the contents inside caught my eye, arresting my movement entirely. Lying flat beneath a stack of old tax returns was a thick, worn leather album. It was unmarked, lacking the gold-embossed lettering Beatrice favored for her official family records. My fingers brushed the cool leather binding. A strange pulling intuition urged me to lift the cover. I pulled the heavy album from the drawer, resting it on my lap. I slowly turned the thick black pages, discovering a secret that my father had kept hidden for over a decade. A secret that exposed a deeply cowardly form of love that was about to shatter the remaining fragments of my heart, leaving me sobbing on the floor of the dark, quiet study. The heavy oak filing cabinet groaned slightly as I rested the worn leather album on my lap. The brass reading lamp cast a warm yellow circle across the dark wood paneling of Julian's study. The room was a sanctuary of classic New England restraint, smelling faintly of damp cedar old paper and the stale pipe tobacco my father used to smoke before Beatrice declared it unseemly. It was the quietest room in the house, a place where Julian retreated to escape the relentless pressure of his wife's social ambitions. I traced the unembossed cover of the album, feeling the cracked texture of the aged leather. A strange, unsettling chill crept down my arms. I slowly flipped open the heavy cover, revealing the thick black pages inside. My breath hitched in my throat. Tucked carefully beneath the clear plastic sleeves were photographs, not the pristine, curated images Beatrice mailed out every December. These were the raw, unedited proofs the photographer had delivered before the heavy gold scissors went to work. I stared at a photo from 5 years ago, the exact image I had found shredded in the recycling bin. There I was, standing in the back row, wearing the cream cable-knit sweater, my sharp jawline and dark birthmark fully visible, unhidden by any forced angles or thick concealer. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. The next page held a photograph from a family vacation in Cape Cod when I was 16. I remembered Beatrice angrily discarding the print because a strong gust of salty wind had blown my hair across my face, ruining the perfect symmetry she desired. Yet here it was, preserved in the album. Page after page revealed a secret archive of my existence: middle school graduations, awkward teenage phases, candid moments in the backyard, laughing at a joke Olivia had made before she learned to care about angles and lighting. Julian had salvaged them all. Every single photograph Beatrice had deemed unacceptable, every image she had tossed into the trash to maintain her flawless aesthetic, Julian had quietly retrieved from the bins. He had smoothed out the crumpled edges and hidden them away in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, locking his daughter in the dark to keep the peace upstairs. His quiet complicity worse than active cruelty. I stared at the saved photographs, wrestling with the crushing weight of my father's silent failure. He cared enough to keep my memory, but he feared his wife too much to ever defend me publicly. He was a corporate actuary, a man who assessed risk for a living. He had calculated the cost of standing up to Beatrice and determined that my emotional survival was not worth the domestic fallout. He chose to love me secretly cowardly, hiding my face in a dark drawer while allowing his wife to physically erase me from the family narrative. A profound, complex grief washed over me, tangling with a deep, burning rage. Beatrice was actively malicious. Her cruelty was a sharp, visible blade. But Julian's complicity was a slow, suffocating poison. He saw the scissors. He watched her cut me out. and his only response was to scavenge the scraps like a rat in the night, hoarding the evidence of my existence rather than demanding I be allowed to live in the light. I traced a finger over a photo of myself at 14, standing awkwardly near a marina in Mystic. Julian had saved it because Beatrice hated how the harsh sun highlighted the uneven pigmentation on my neck. The cowardice of it all slammed into my chest. He handed me 5 crumpled $100 bills in a freezing garage to fund my escape because he lacked the spine to protect me under his own roof. A sudden violent impulse seized my body. The boiling anger from the rehearsal dinner, the humiliation of the seafoam bridesmaid dress, and the sheer pathetic reality of this hidden album converged into a blinding flash of fury. I grabbed the photograph from the plastic sleeve. My hands gripped the edges of the glossy paper. I ripped the photograph aggressively down the middle, tearing my own 14-year-old face perfectly in half with a loud, sharp tearing sound. The violent action broke the spell. The sudden sound of the ripping paper echoed in the quiet study, startling me back to reality. I stared at the 2 severed halves of the photograph resting in my shaking hands. A wave of intense, sickening regret instantly replaced the anger. I had just destroyed one of the only pieces of evidence that proved my father actually wanted to look at my face. "Oh, God, no," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No, no, no." I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor, scrambling off the leather chair. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, my knees hitting the expensive Persian rug. Tears spilled over my eyelashes, hot and fast, blurring my vision. I frantically patted the floor, searching for the jagged halves of the photograph. I found them near the leg of the filing cabinet. I grabbed the pieces, pushing them together on the rug, desperately trying to align the torn edges. The tear ran directly through the center of my neck, splitting the dark birthmark. "I need tape," I sobbed, my voice hitching wildly in my throat. "I need to fix it." I crawled across the rug, blindly pulling open the top drawers of Julian's desk, searching for supplies. I knocked over a cup of pens, scattering them across the hardwood. I finally found a roll of clear Scotch tape buried under a stack of envelopes. I sat back on the floor, crying uncontrollably. My hands shook so badly I could barely peel the tape from the plastic dispenser. I pulled a long, jagged strip, letting it stick to my thumb. I pressed the 2 halves of the photo flat against the rug, smoothing the glossy paper with trembling fingers. I clumsily applied the tape over the tear, pressing it down hard, trying to seal the breach I had just created. The tape was crooked. A tiny gap remained between the torn edges, leaving a visible, jagged scar across the image. I stared at the poorly mended photograph, my shoulders heaving with ragged, heavy sobs. I was a weeping, broken mess sitting on the floor of a dark study, frantically trying to tape my own torn face back together. I hugged my knees to my chest, resting my forehead against my arms, letting the grief consume me entirely. I cried for the father who hid me in a drawer. I cried for the mother who used her body to block me from the lens. And I cried for the terrified girl on the floor who still desperately wanted to be loved by the people who kept destroying her. I sat in the damp-smelling study for over an hour until the tears finally ran dry, leaving my throat raw and my chest hollow. The house remained silent. The rehearsal dinner at the yacht club was likely winding down. Julian and Beatrice would be returning soon. I carefully slid the taped photograph back into the plastic sleeve of the leather album. I closed the heavy cover, returning the book to the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. I pushed the drawer shut, listening to the metal tracks click into place, locking the secret away once more. I wiped my swollen eyes with the back of my hand, pulling myself up from the floor. I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom, shedding the awful seafoam green bridesmaid dress. I changed into a simple pair of dark jeans and a plain black sweater. I walked over to the closet, retrieving the cardboard box Beatrice had mentioned earlier. Inside were hundreds of numbered plastic tags and a rigid, detailed guest list mapping out the coat check hierarchy for the main reception tomorrow. I sat on the edge of my bed, organizing the small plastic squares, assigning numbers to the wealthy guests who had ignored me at the yacht club. I was preparing to perform my menial duties to hide in the background, while Olivia took center stage in her sprawling white canvas tent. I assumed the wedding day would be a long, grueling endurance test. A few hours of handling heavy winter coats and avoiding eye contact with my family. I planned to slip out the back entrance the moment the reception ended, retreating to Brooklyn and leaving Connecticut behind forever. I had absolutely no idea that the extravagant event was about to become the site of a massive, unavoidable collision. I did not know that the elite wedding photographer hired by Olivia was not a local vendor, but a prominent figure from the New York avant-garde art scene, a man who knew exactly who I was and what massive high-fashion campaign I had just headlined. I was walking directly into a trap that would violently shatter the quiet, isolated existence I had carefully maintained, dragging my two separate worlds into a devastating, highly public confrontation under the white canvas of the reception tent. The morning of Olivia's wedding dawned with crisp, sharp sunlight over the Long Island Sound. I woke early, the exhaustion from crying on Julian's study floor, leaving a dull ache behind my eyes. The house buzzed with frantic energy. Catering crews lugged heavy silver chafing dishes through the front door, while florists arranged towering displays of white hydrangeas and imported roses in the foyer. Beatrice moved through the chaos like a general directing a battlefield, barking precise orders at delivery men and hovering anxiously over the hair and makeup team in the living room. I stayed upstairs, avoiding the frenzy. I dressed in the simple black uniform required for the event staff, a modest knee-length dress that allowed me to blend seamlessly into the background. I tied my hair back, securing it tightly, ensuring my sharp jawline and the dark birthmark on my neck were fully exposed. If I was going to serve as coat check staff, I refused to hide behind layers of thick concealer. An hour before the ceremony began, a sharp knock rapped against my bedroom door. Beatrice pushed it open, her face flushed with stress. She wore a tailored champagne-colored gown, heavily beaded at the bodice. She did not comment on my unhidden birthmark. She was entirely focused on the immediate crisis downstairs. Olivia caught the hem of her train on a decorative iron chair in the bridal suite. Beatrice snapped her voice tight with panic. "There are frayed threads hanging off the Chantilly lace. Get downstairs and fix it before the photographer arrives for the pre-ceremony portraits." She marched over to my dresser and slapped a heavy metallic object down on the polished wood. My stomach plummeted. The heavy gold sewing scissors. The exact same pair she had used 5 years ago, sitting at the kitchen island, manually snipping my face out of the glossy holiday prints. The polished gold handles gleamed under the bedroom light, a chilling physical manifestation of my erasure. She was handing me the very weapon she used to sever me from the family narrative, ordering me to use it to perfect Olivia's aesthetic. "Do not dawdle, Charlotte," Beatrice ordered, turning back toward the door. "The string quartet is already setting up on the lawn." I picked up the heavy scissors, feeling the cold metal press against my palm. A sickening wave of claustrophobia washed over me. The house felt like a closing vice, trapping me inside the rigid confines of my assigned role. I walked downstairs, entering the bridal suite, where Olivia stood on a small velvet pedestal, admiring her reflection in a full-length mirror. "Hold still," I muttered, kneeling on the hardwood floor. I gathered the delicate Chantilly lace of the train in my left hand, locating the jagged, frayed threads. I opened the gold scissors, the sharp blades catching the bright vanity lights. With a quick, precise motion, I snipped the loose threads away, ensuring the hem looked flawless. I performed the menial task perfectly, maintaining the pristine image my family demanded. The ceremony proceeded without incident. I stood near the back of the white wooden folding chairs, watching Olivia exchange vows with Preston against the backdrop of the Long Island Sound. Julian looked proud, Beatrice looked triumphant, and I remained entirely invisible, holding a clipboard detailing the coat check logistics for the upcoming reception. The reception was hosted inside a sprawling, massive white canvas tent, pitched directly on the manicured coastline. The interior was a masterpiece of coastal wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm glow over dozens of round tables draped in heavy ivory linens. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with raw local oysters on ice and pouring excessively expensive vintage champagne into tall flutes. I took my position near the rear entrance of the tent, setting up my station behind a long folding table. A heavy metal rack stood behind me, ready to receive the cashmere coats and tailored blazers of the arriving guests. I organized the small numbered plastic tags, creating a neat, efficient system to manage the evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the coastline into darkness. The tent glowed like a beacon, drawing the elite guests inside. I spent the first hour of the reception engaged in the repetitive mechanical work of taking coats, handing out plastic tags, and avoiding eye contact with the wealthy attendees who handed me their garments without a second glance. The string orchestra transitioned into an upbeat jazz set, signaling the end of the cocktail hour. The guests began migrating toward their assigned tables, leaving the coat check area relatively quiet. I leaned against the folding table, taking a deep breath of the cool, salty air, drifting in through the open tent flaps. I believed the worst of the evening had passed. I planned to stand quietly in the shadows until the reception concluded. Then I heard a loud, boisterous laugh echoing near the main entrance of the tent. The sound was distinct, carrying a heavy French accent that sliced through the polite New England murmur. I froze my hand, hovering over a row of plastic tags. I knew that laugh. I had heard it echoing through a freezing alleyway in Tribeca, shouting directions over the roar of a brutal nor'easter. I peeked around the edge of a towering floral arrangement, scanning the crowd near the entrance. Walking toward the center of the tent, slapping Preston enthusiastically on the shoulder, was Antoine, the creative director for the luxury French fashion house. The exact executive who had cast me for the global campaign, who had demanded my eyebrows be bleached and my hair slicked back, who had overseen the placement of the 50-foot digital billboard illuminating Times Square. He was here, in Westport, at my sister's wedding. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic, erratic pounding that threatened to shatter my chest. The two entirely separate worlds I had carefully kept apart, the gritty, high-stakes reality of New York and the suffocating, superficial facade of Connecticut, were hurtling toward a violent, unavoidable collision right in the middle of the white canvas tent. Antoine was a close friend of Preston's family, an old money connection forged through elite European boarding schools and shared wealth. He was attending the wedding as an honored guest, blissfully unaware that the anonymous muse headlining his multi-million-dollar campaign was currently standing 20 feet away, holding a clipboard and organizing coat hangers. Where is the strangest place you have ever hidden during a panic attack? A blinding wave of sheer, unadulterated terror crashed over me. If Antoine saw me standing behind the coat check table, the carefully constructed illusion of my anonymity would evaporate instantly. The realization that the celebrated face of his brand was working menial labor at a suburban wedding would trigger a massive public spectacle. Beatrice would discover the truth in the most humiliating, chaotic way possible. I could not breathe. The air inside the tent suddenly felt thick and suffocating, smelling overwhelmingly of raw oysters and expensive perfume. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I dropped the clipboard onto the table, the metal clip clattering loudly against the wood. I bolted. I abandoned the coat check station, pushing past a confused waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. I sprinted out the rear exit of the tent, stumbling onto the soft, damp grass of the lawn. The cold night air hit my face, but it did nothing to slow my racing heart. I needed to hide. I scanned the dark grounds, desperately searching for cover. Near the edge of the property, hidden behind a row of tall, manicured hedges, sat a row of portable restrooms, brought in to accommodate the large guest list. They were high-end units designed to resemble actual bathrooms, but they were still cramped, temporary structures. I grabbed the handle of the nearest unit, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut, flipping the plastic lock into place. The small space smelled of strong chemical deodorizer and damp paper towels. A single dim overhead bulb cast a sickly yellow light. I collapsed onto the closed lid of the toilet, pulling my knees tight against my chest. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps. I was hyperventilating, the oxygen burning my throat as I struggled to pull air into my restricted lungs. Sweat beaded across my forehead, dampening my hairline and soaking the collar of my simple black dress. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to block out the harsh yellow light, trying to force the panic down. I sat curled in a tight ball inside a humid, cramped portable restroom, shaking uncontrollably, hiding from the very success I had bled to achieve. The bitter irony twisted the knife deeper into my chest. I had survived predatory contracts, freezing street shoots, and crippling eczema outbreaks, only to cower in a temporary toilet, afraid of my own mother finding out I had won. I stayed locked in that cramped, foul-smelling box, for 20 agonizing minutes, fighting a brutal internal war. The distant muffled sound of the jazz band played through the thin plastic walls, mocking my breakdown. I stared at my shaking hands, realizing the deep, lingering trauma of Beatrice's gold scissors still dictated my actions. She had trained me to hide my flaws, to shrink into the background, to fear the spotlight. And I was obeying her conditioning perfectly, hiding my massive victory in the dark, because I was terrified of disrupting her pristine aesthetic. I lowered my hands. The frantic beating of my heart began to slow, settling into a heavy, steady rhythm. The intense panic burned itself out, leaving a cold, exhausted clarity in its wake. I could stay hidden in the bathroom until the reception ended, securing my secret and maintaining the quiet, miserable peace of my role as the invisible sister. Or I could unlock the door, walk back into the brightly lit tent, and face the collision head-on. I reached for the plastic latch, flipping it open with a loud, definitive click. I pushed the heavy door outward, stepping back onto the damp grass. The cool coastal breeze chilled the sweat on my neck. I smoothed the wrinkles from my black dress, lifting my chin to expose the dark birthmark. I was done hiding in the dark. I was walking back into the light, prepared to face the explosive, chaotic unmasking that was waiting for me under the white canvas roof. The damp grass soaked through the thin soles of my plain black flats as I walked back toward the sprawling white canvas tent. The cool coastal air did little to settle the nervous heat radiating from my skin. I slipped through the rear entrance, returning to the coat check station. My clipboard sat exactly where I dropped it, an unorganized mess of plastic tags scattered across the folding table. I took a deep, shuddering breath, gripping the edge of the table to steady my trembling hands. The reception was in full swing. The jazz band had stopped playing, replaced by the rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses as the best man began his speech. The entire room focused on the head table where Olivia and Preston sat basking in the glow of the expensive spotlight. Beatrice sat beside Julian, her posture rigid with pride, her heavy silk scarf, the very one bearing the logo of my campaign, draped perfectly over her shoulders. I kept my head down, pretending to organize the plastic tags, hoping the speeches would keep the crowd occupied. But fate rarely respects a frantic desire to remain unseen. A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the low murmur of the crowd, demanding a fresh glass of champagne. Antoine, the French creative director, was moving away from the head table, striding directly toward the rear of the tent to intercept a passing waiter. He walked with the heavy, confident gait of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He grabbed a flute from the silver tray, turning around to scan the room. His gaze swept over the dance floor, the towering floral arrangements and the scattered tables. Then his eyes landed on the coat check station. He stopped mid-turn, the champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his crystal flute. He squinted, peering through the dim ambient lighting, trying to reconcile the face standing behind the folding table with the towering image currently dominating Times Square. I froze my hand, hovering over a plastic hanger. The blood drained from my face, pooling heavily in my stomach. The 20 minutes I spent hyperventilating in the portable restroom had not prepared me for this exact moment of exposure. Antoine took 3 long, rapid strides toward my station, closing the distance between us. He did not whisper. He did not ask for confirmation. He possessed the loud, oblivious certainty of a creative genius who believed the entire world existed to serve his artistic vision. Mon Dieu, he bellowed, his voice carrying a booming theatrical resonance that sliced through the quiet attention of the wedding guests. This is incredible. This is absolute genius. The best man paused his speech, lowering his microphone. Dozens of heads swiveled toward the back of the tent. Antoine threw his arms wide, gesturing dramatically toward me. He turned to face the stunned crowd, including Preston and Olivia at the head table. "Preston, you did not tell me you hired my leading muse for an installation," Antoine shouted, his heavy accent echoing off the canvas walls. "They have the face of our global campaign taking coats. The irony, the juxtaposition of high fashion and servitude, it is brilliant performance art." A profound, heavy silence dropped over the tent. The clinking glasses stopped. The polite murmurs vanished. 400 wealthy Connecticut socialites turned their collective gaze toward the plain folding table in the back corner. How would you handle accidental, massive public exposure? I stood paralyzed, pinned under the weight of hundreds of staring eyes. My pulse hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm in my ears. I wanted the ground beneath the manicured lawn to split open and swallow me whole. I was not engaged in brilliant performance art. I was a terrified outcast caught working a menial chore at a party I was banned from attending. At the head table, Beatrice slowly lowered her champagne flute. The color leached from her face, leaving her normally pristine complexion a sickly ashen gray. Her eyes darted from Antoine to me, her mind struggling to process the impossible information. The unpolished, flawed daughter she had hidden in the back row was being publicly lauded by the highest echelon of the fashion world she worshipped. The guests sitting near the front, many of whom were wealthy elite, clutching cocktail napkins and wearing the exact luxury accessories Antoine designed, began to murmur. The whispers spread rapidly through the tent, a rising tide of localized gossip. "Is that the girl from the Billboard? I thought Patricia said her other daughter worked in accounting. Did she say global campaign?" The social hierarchy within the room shifted with dizzying, terrifying speed. The guests who had ignored me all evening, who had handed me their coats without a second glance, suddenly sat up straighter, adjusting their posture, displaying a sudden sycophantic eagerness to be near the newly revealed celebrity. Antoine marched right up to my folding table, leaning over the plastic tags. "Charlotte, darling," he said, his voice dripping with loud, performative affection. "The billboard in Times Square looks phenomenal. The raw grit we captured in that freezing alley, it is the talk of Paris. But why are you hiding back here playing the coat girl?" He reached across the table, gripping my shoulders and kissing both of my cheeks in a standard industry greeting. He smelled strongly of expensive cologne and stale champagne. I needed to project cool, detached power. I needed to offer a triumphant smirk to my stunned mother and sister, proving I had conquered the very world they prized. I needed to deliver a sharp, witty response that cemented my status and left them burning with envy. Instead, my body betrayed my intentions. The overwhelming rush of sudden, unwanted attention triggered a deep, visceral panic. I physically flinched, pulling back from Antoine's embrace with an awkward, jerky motion. A deep, splotchy red flush crawled up my neck, settling hotly across my cheeks, broadcasting my extreme discomfort to the entire room. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper, completely devoid of any high-fashion mystique. "Thank you, Antoine. I am just helping out." I reached blindly for a small silver oyster fork resting on a nearby catering tray, intending to steady my shaking hands. My clumsy, trembling fingers knocked the utensil off the silver platter. The fork hit the hard wooden floorboards installed over the grass with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed painfully in the silent tent. I stared down at the dropped fork, my face burning with profound humiliation. I was the face of a multi-million-dollar campaign. Yet in front of my family, I reverted instantly to the awkward, stumbling girl who dropped her wallet on the Metro North. The messy, unpolished reality of my reaction clashed violently with the sophisticated image Antoine had just projected to the room. At the head table, Olivia finally found her voice. Her perfect bridal facade cracked, revealing a petty, furious jealousy. "What is he talking about, Charlotte?" she demanded, standing up, her white silk gown rustling loudly. "You are on a billboard. Why did you not tell anyone?" Beatrice stood up next, placing a restraining hand on Olivia's arm, but her own eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate calculation. The mother who had spent 2 decades cropping me out of the narrative was rapidly assessing the immense social capital standing behind the coat check table. The guests were watching her, expecting the proud matriarch to claim the famous daughter she had hidden away. Antoine, oblivious to the deep, toxic currents running through the family, turned back to Beatrice. "Patricia," he called out mistakenly, using my mother's formal name. "You kept this a secret. Your daughter is a sensation. She possesses a raw, striking beauty that cannot be manufactured. You must be incredibly proud." Beatrice looked at Antoine, then at the wealthy guests leaning in to hear her response. Her paralyzing terror of social judgment warred with her deep-seated rejection of my appearance. She looked down at her own shoulders, touching the expensive silk scarf draped across her collarbone, the very brand that had elevated my raw, unedited face over her pastel perfection. The tension in the tent tightened, stretching thin and fragile, ready to snap. I remained standing behind the folding table, my face burning, my hands shaking, waiting to see which version of my mother would emerge. Would she cling to the cruel aesthetic that had driven me to Brooklyn? Or would she attempt to hijack my hard-won success to salvage her own reputation in front of the elite society she feared? The impending confrontation was about to force a final devastating choice, pushing our fractured relationship to a breaking point that neither of us could ever undo. The heavy canvas flap of the reception tent fell shut behind me, muffling the stunned silence of the wealthy guests. The damp grass of the coastal lawn soaked through my plain black flats, a sharp contrast to the expensive wooden floorboards I had just abandoned. The crisp autumn air drifting off the Long Island Sound hit my flushed face, cooling the panicked heat radiating from my skin. I did not pause to look back at the sprawling white structure glowing against the dark Connecticut night. I kept walking, my pace steady and deliberate, moving toward the gravel parking lot where my beat-up sedan was parked among rows of luxury SUVs. I reached my car, pulling my keys from the pocket of the plain black uniform dress. My hands were still trembling, the residual adrenaline from the confrontation warring with a bone-deep exhaustion. I unlocked the door, tossing my small duffel bag onto the passenger seat. "Charlotte, wait." The voice cut through the quiet night, frantic and breathless. I turned, gripping the door handle. Olivia was marching across the gravel, her pristine white silk wedding gown catching the dim, ambient light from the distant tent. She held the heavy fabric bunched in her fists, keeping it out of the mud, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She stopped a few feet away, chest heaving. The golden child, the sister who had taken a selfie under my Times Square billboard without recognizing my face, was finally looking directly at me. But there was no sudden realization, no tearful, sisterly reconciliation. "You ruined it!" She hissed, her voice tight and venomous. "You ruined my wedding day." I stared at her, the sheer absurdity of the accusation washing over me. I had not asked the French creative director to attend. I had not invited the public unmasking. I had simply stood behind the coat check table doing the menial labor she and Beatrice demanded. "I did not do anything, Olivia." I said, my voice flat, stripped of any defensive heat. Antoine recognized me. "That is not my fault." "Do not play the victim," she yelled, taking a step closer. "You planned this. You wanted to embarrass Mom in front of Preston's family. You always resented me because you could not fit in. You could have just stayed in the back quietly like you were supposed to, but you had to make a scene." She genuinely believed her own narrative. The profound depth of her narcissism shielded her from the brutal reality of Beatrice's cruelty. Olivia was incapable of seeing the toxic dynamic that favored her, because acknowledging my pain would force her to examine the shallow, hollow foundation of her own pristine existence. "I am not the one who handed you gold sewing scissors," I replied quietly, stepping into the driver's seat. "Enjoy your aesthetic, Olivia. I hope it keeps you warm." I pulled the car door shut, leaving her standing in the gravel, her white gown glowing in the darkness, throwing a petty, furious tantrum because the spotlight had briefly shifted away from her. I turned the key, the engine rattling to life. As I shifted into reverse, another figure emerged from the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. Julian, my father, approached the car, his posture stooped, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored suit. He walked around to the driver's side, tapping lightly on the cold glass. I lowered the window, letting the freezing air rush in. Julian looked exhausted, his face pale and lined with a heavy sorrow. Clutched tightly against his chest was the worn leather album he kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his study, the secret archive of my discarded photographs. "Charlotte," he started, his voice cracking a fragile, broken sound. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." I looked at the album and then up at his tear-filled eyes. The anger I felt in the study had evaporated, leaving only a profound pity. He cared enough to hoard the scraps of my existence, but he was too terrified to defend the living, breathing daughter standing in front of him. "Are you going to leave her, Dad?" I asked, my tone gentle but unyielding. "Are you going to tell those people in the tent what Beatrice actually did?" Julian flinched, physically shrinking away from the question. He looked back toward the glowing white tent, the fear evident in his rigid posture. He shook his head slowly, a small, defeated movement. "I cannot," he whispered, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "I cannot leave. I do not know how to live any other way." He offered a cowardly apology, acknowledging his failure while admitting he lacked the spine to change it. He was choosing his comfortable, miserable captivity over my survival. "I know," I said, rolling the window back up. "Goodbye, Dad." I shifted into drive and pulled away, leaving the 2 remaining pieces of my fractured family standing in the dark gravel lot. There was no magical healing, no neat cinematic resolution where the villains realized the error of their ways and begged for forgiveness. They remained exactly who they were, trapped in the toxic cycles they built for themselves. I merged onto the dark, desolate stretch of Interstate 95 heading south. The manicured wealth of coastal Connecticut faded away, replaced by the glowing red taillights of long-haul trucks and the isolating darkness of the highway. Have you ever won the battle but realized the war was not worth fighting? I sat alone in the cold car, gripping the steering wheel. I had delivered the ultimate poetic justice. I had publicly rejected Beatrice's transactional validation, leaving the gold scissors on the floorboards for 400 elite guests to see. I had proven my worth commanding a Times Square billboard and securing a lucrative contract that guaranteed my financial independence. I had conquered the system that tried to erase me. But staring at the yellow dashed lines flashing past the windshield, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel a surging wave of empowering triumph. The adrenaline that had carried me through the unmasking, the confrontation, and the escape suddenly plummeted, abandoning my system entirely. The heavy, suffocating reality of what just happened crashed down on my chest. I had won the confrontation, but winning did not magically erase 28 years of deep emotional neglect. It did not heal the raw, stinging wound of realizing my mother only valued me when I became a status symbol. It did not fix my father's cowardly silence or my sister's vapid cruelty. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit me hard and fast, my stomach cramped, rolling violently against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, soaking my hairline. I gripped the wheel, swerving the beat-up sedan onto the rough gravel shoulder of the highway 3 miles past the Westport exit. I slammed the car into park, shoving the heavy door open. I stumbled out into the freezing night air, dropping to my hands and knees in the damp, overgrown grass lining the interstate. My body convulsed, purging the sheer, overwhelming stress of the weekend. I retched aggressively, my throat burning, coughing and spitting onto the cold ground, while massive semi-trucks roared past, shaking the pavement beneath me. I stayed on my knees, shivering in the plain black uniform dress, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. The harsh, bright headlights of passing cars illuminated my hunched, vulnerable form. I was a weeping, vomiting mess, stranded on the side of a dark highway, light years away from the fierce, untouched muse staring down from the digital billboard. This was the messy, unpolished reality of survival. The confrontation in the tent was necessary, but it did not provide a cure. The timeline of my own healing was not going to be wrapped up in a neat, satisfying weekend. It would take years of therapy, years of untangling the deep-seated trauma that still caused me to hide in portable restrooms and stutter in front of cameras. I pushed myself up off the damp grass, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the cold, exhaust-filled air. I grabbed a napkin from the glove compartment, wiping my face and rinsing my mouth from a half-empty water bottle. I climbed back into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut and turning the heater on high. I merged back onto the interstate, leaving the dark, quiet stretch of Connecticut behind me, heading toward the harsh, concrete reality of the city. The journey ahead was uncertain. The lucrative campaign provided financial security, but the intense pressure of the fashion industry would continue to test the fragile boundaries I was building. The physical manifestation of my trauma, the severe eczema outbreaks that threatened my contract, would likely return, requiring constant management and care. I did not have a supportive family waiting for me in Brooklyn. I had an empty sublet and a grueling schedule. But looking at the glowing dashboard clock, I realized a fundamental shift had occurred during that chaotic wedding reception. For the first time in 28 years, I was driving away from Westport without the crushing, desperate need for Beatrice's approval. I no longer sought the validation of a mother who cropped me out of the frame or a father who hid me in a drawer. The unmasking had severed the final invisible thread tying me to their toxic approval. The healing process would be long, ugly, and non-linear, but as the towering skyline of Manhattan appeared on the horizon, glowing brightly against the dark night sky, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman gripping the steering wheel, scarred, flawed, and exhausted, finally belonged entirely to herself. 2 years have passed since I drove away from that white canvas tent in Connecticut. The Times Square billboard was eventually taken down, replaced by another brand, another face, another season. My career in the New York fashion industry stabilized into a steady, reliable rhythm. I bought a small loft in Brooklyn with exposed brick and large windows that let the morning sun pour over my drafting table. The heavy gold sewing scissors remain a distant memory left behind on the wooden floorboards of a life I no longer inhabit. I still attend therapy every Thursday. The eczema on my neck flares up when deadlines loom, a physical reminder that trauma does not vanish simply because you change your zip code. But looking back at the girl who pulled over on the shoulder of Interstate 95, sick with stress and shivering in the dark, I realize survival does not come from a single dramatic triumph. It comes from the quiet, agonizing work of untangling the lies you were raised to believe. If you are navigating your own escape from a home that requires you to shrink, here are the 5 truths I carry with me now. First, the validation you crave from toxic people is always a trap. My mother's sudden affection during the reception was not love. It was social currency. Accepting her embrace would have bankrupted my soul just to save her reputation. Second, passive complicity leaves the deepest scars. The parent who stands by quietly while you are erased is making an active choice. My father's hidden photo album was not a rescue mission. It was a monument to his own cowardice, proving that knowing the truth and acting on it are 2 very different things. Third, your deepest insecurities often hold your greatest power. The birthmark and sharp angles I was taught to hide beneath thick concealer became the exact features that built my independence. The world pays attention when you stop apologizing for your own face. Fourth real victory is walking out of the frame. You do not win by screaming the loudest or delivering a flawless cinematic insult. You win by dropping the weapon they handed you and refusing to participate in the aesthetic of your own destruction. Fifth, healing is not glamorous. It does not look like a neat, triumphant movie ending. It looks like pulling over on a dark highway and purging the anxiety from your body. It is messy, nonlinear, and entirely unpolished, but it belongs to you. I do not speak to Beatrice or Olivia. Julian sends a card on my birthday, which I read and place in a drawer without replying. The door is not locked, but I am no longer waiting by the handle. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you know what it feels like to step out of the shadows, drop the scissors, and reclaim your own identity, please subscribe to Olivia Tells Stories. Leave a comment below, sharing the hardest boundary you ever had to set with the people who raised you. We are building a community of survivors here, and your voice deserves to be heard. Until the next chapter, keep fighting for the real you.